Welcome to our second day of our work meeting retreat. A little less formal setting where we take a day or a day and a half to roll up our sleeves and get work done. And I was really excited about the conversation we were able to have yesterday and the information we were able to get from community development, their philosophy for our zoning and what they feel, where they feel we need to work on the zoning code and our general plan, and where we were able to talk about issues regarding our zoning, and felt like it was really, at least for me, a very beneficial conversation. And look forward to today. Looking forward to today for quite a while. Last year we spoke about, before I get started, I should say that it is 8:45 on Friday, January 8th, 2016, and we are meeting in room 310 of the City Center Conference Room, 351 West Center Street, Provo. And we'll begin with the roll call, and if you wouldn't mind starting out, Mr. Stewart, with roll call. Roll call.
George Stewart. Dave Knack.
Kim Santiago.
Gary Winterton. Dave Sewell. Dave Harding. John Curtis.
Louise Jurgensen.
Brian Herman. Brian Jones. Norman. Dustin Graybaugh. John Morgan. Wayne Parker.
Karen Jalopy.
Kenny Martin. Larry Walters.
Great. Thank you. We're going to open with prayer, and we have that sign. Mr. Hart, would you mind?
Our Father in heaven, we are grateful for the beautiful city in which we live and for the opportunities that it provides. We are grateful for public trust to lead this city, and we ask for thy direction in leading our discussion or decisions. We ask thee to help us to be alert, and ask thee to help us to learn and exchange our ideas well, that we may better fulfill our duties. We ask thee to bless those who represent you, that they may effectively communicate their ideas. Ask thee to continue to watch over our city. This we pray in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
As was mentioned before, yesterday we spoke about land use and planning in that regard. Today we're going to be focusing on budget items, and with the goal of coming together or being able to discuss this afternoon what our priorities, our long-range goals and priorities, and hopefully by the end of the day, I'm really hopeful that we'll be able to have a few long-range goals, overarching goals that the council is agreeable to, that we find some areas where we're thinking alike in the direction that we would like to go. So the first item to be discussed is budgeting for outcomes, and we're really grateful to Jeff Riggs and Nate Rockford for being here for Park City. As you remember, some of the former council members remember, or from last year, you remember that the budget committee, Dr. Larry Walters brought this idea forward to us, and we had a little introduction to it last year, but we felt that we needed more information on the nuts and bolts of, or not really the nuts and bolts, but the maybe lessons learned, what things Park City learned from going through this experience. They could share some of their ideas of how things went well, maybe how things what they would change if they could do it all over again, if anything. And I would mostly just want the opportunity to, after they give us the presentation and then share their experience with us and their presentation, have a very open conversation in our form of government. Their mayor sits on there. It's a voting member of the council. Is that correct? No, it's not the.
So it's a council manager form, but the mayor is a non-voting.
Okay, so he's non-voting.
Unless there's a tie or something.
But he's on the council.
He's on council.
Okay. And our part of it is a little bit different in that we're more like federal and state government, right? The council is legislative body and the mayor is the executive branch, the mayor and the administration, the executive branch. And so it's a little bit different how we may need to approach it, but this is just an exciting opportunity for us to see how it's worked for your city and appreciate it. I mean, especially on a nurturing day, it's probably a little bit very not too bad for the travel. Okay. Well, thank you. So we'll get started if you'd like to.
Do you want us to stand up here?
That would be great. For it. Let's see.
So I'm Nate Rockwood. I'm the capital budget debt and grants manager at the city. I've been there for about 8 years. Jed's the budget operations manager. We're both in the budget department and that department. Jed's been there about 9 years. So I'm going to kind of go through the introductions of sort of why the city decided to go that direction. Since Jed does the budget operations, budgeting for outcomes is sort of a budget operations process. And then I'll tie in a little bit on how the capital interacts with that, which we've integrated those two things together. So they work pretty seamlessly together now. But just I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail because you know Park City, but just so you get a frame of reference, permanent population just under 8,000 people. That service population sometimes in the peak, like at Sundance and things, can reach upward of 80,000. Most of the time it's in the 40, 50,000 during winter. Operating budget about 45 million, capital about 33 million for this fiscal year we're in. The debt that we anticipate is about 11 million, but we've got about 1.5 million of outstanding debt. If you were to look at debt, the GEO bond rating of AA+, which is good for a community of 8,000 people, and then obviously full-time staff that's pretty large for a city of 8,000 people, but that's because of the service population. And then, like we just talked about, council form of government, so quite a bit different than what you're doing, but I think that the majority of what VFO does can be pretty easily adaptable as we go through it. Just a breakdown of where our revenues come from, and this is all of our funds. So we do operate a transit system in a water district, but we have a pretty balanced income with the water fees, but property tax and sales tax make up about a third of our operating budget, and when you get into the general fund, that's where we're at. One of the reasons that we went into doing the budgeting for outcomes or the priority-based budgeting process is we were going through a period where the council wanted to do several projects, and then also at the same time, then we went into a recession, and so we had a period where we didn't want to cut things. We still wanted to figure out ways to fund the projects that we've been planning. And there was a proposal at that point that maybe we needed to raise the property tax. And obviously that brings out a lot of citizens with different opinions about that. And one of the things that we got from that as a council and from staff was before putting a proposal like that out there to the public, we really wanted to make sure that we really got a sense from the public that they said, we're okay with that so long as you can assure us that you've done everything within your budget to make sure that you're running as lean as you can be and that you're efficient as you can be. And we were doing an incremental style budget at that time, basically just building on the past every year and bumping things up. And if some budget had been inflated for some reason for some project that they were working on, often you didn't come back when that was done and reduce it. So it was very difficult to go in there and say, when the public was standing there, to say, yes, we've gone through every single department and every single budget and we've cleaned everything out. You can say that, but how do you show that? And that's really where we started looking into budgeting for outcomes. And Jen will go a lot more into the detail of what that is. But really what we were trying to do there is the next time we ever came with a property tax proposal, which we didn't end up raising the property tax. But we wanted to be able to say, here are all of our services that we provide. Here they all are prioritized in matching what council wants the community to be. And here's the process that we go through on an annual basis to determine if we're meeting the goals of each one of those areas of service. And really be able to say to the public, we feel like we've done everything we can and that we can assure you that we're running an efficient government here. And this is what we need. And so that's why we really embraced the budgeting for outcomes. Through it, there's been a lot of other positives that have come, and there's been a lot of struggles that have come up with it. And I think Jen will go into those a lot. But one of the things that we really have seen through it is the transparency that it's brought to the public, and a council member being able to talk to the public and have an understanding of the budget, where if a citizen came up and said, how much is beautification on Main Street? The council member wouldn't have to say, well, that's part of our parks and rec, and there's, they do 50 different things and it's a portion of it. They can really go down, and through the BFO process, they could have a cost sheet that basically says, this is this service, this is how much it costs, this is how many people work on it. And someone can look at it and say, okay, I understand how much the costs are. The costs aren't buried in a huge budget that the layman person would look at and their eyes glaze over and they wouldn't get to understand it. And I think that that's really been one of the huge benefits of it. One of the reasons that you go into a budgeting for outcomes process is that you're really prioritizing all of these services that you provide. And if you are in a time when you need to cut the budget, you can really look at all those services and figure out, okay, now we know how these are listed as far as how they're prioritized in the community and where we should start cutting, as opposed to going out and saying, well, we need more money, so we're going to cut, ambulance service. You can instead go in and actually cut based on, I think, a legitimate priority.
Do we ask questions, or should we go wait for this could take a long time if we start asking questions too soon. Sorry.
And maybe just write down our questions and we'll do another presentation.
Yeah. To start our budget process, we go through a process that we call the FIR, which is the Financial Indicators Report. And that's really a 10-year projection where we're projecting out all the revenues, specifically to the general fund and to that portion of the general fund that would go towards capital. And then we also project out the expected expenditures and how those are going to grow. We present that to council right around the same time that you guys are having this retreat, so at the beginning of the budget process. But that really is able to give us a long-range view when we're deciding how much to increase funding that stays in the general fund versus funding that goes to the capital. And it gives the council a big overview of how we look long-term. One of the things that we've always noticed long-term is that as you may know, the property tax laws in Utah don't have the inflationary component when 1/3 of our revenues come from that property tax, that as the services cost more year over year, or as council adds services to what the city is doing, that property tax component isn't keeping up with those increases. So we become more reliant on sales tax. So we're always with this FIRE, making sure council's aware of there's some strategies of, as much as we want to stay lean, when you don't have 1/3 of your revenue inflating, if there isn't any growth, which we didn't see during the recession, obviously the growth was down to next to nothing. And services keep costing more, you're going to have a problem. So we always want to make sure council's aware of that long-term problem. But this also helps us, even though now that we're in a recovery period and we're not trying to cut budgets, it also, with the BFO process and through this FIR, we're able to limit how much expenditures grow based on the long-term projections, so that we're not, right now, sales tax have gone good. The economy in Park City has been really good over the last 5 years. And so it would be easy if you weren't looking long-term for a council to say, our expenditures should match the revenue growth that we're seeing. And with this process, then we're able to pull back from that and say, let's take a more conservative approach that's going to have us have a balanced budget for the next 10 years, 15 years, and have a strategy ongoing. I think the BFO process plays a big part of that. So,
great. Thanks, Nate. So and they were saying, we've been at the city, Park City, quite a while. But we are BYU grads, just so you know. We do come from Provo, and Dr. Walters was our professor for a couple of my classes, actually, and I was the TA. So I actually know Dr. Walters pretty well. So we're, deeply blue, right? So it's interesting, being in Park City, because, a lot of the people up there are transplants in California and things like that. So you don't get a lot of cougar love up there. So we kind of represent. That's why it's kind of funny to come back down here and we feel like we're amongst friends here.
And you dressed appropriately.
Yeah, exactly. Cougar blue here. So just some of the stuff that I want to talk about, as Nate was saying, I'm in charge of managing, facilitating the operating budget, working on strategic planning with our city manager, Diane Foster, who wanted to be here, but she's actually taking off pretty soon to Mexico today, so she couldn't come down. But she's more than excited to have us come down and talk about this process. And we're in the process right now of planning for our retreat. Ours typically is just a little bit later. We're looking at the beginning of March to have our council retreat. Normally it's earlier in the year. We pushed it back just a few weeks for a couple of different reasons. We have the Sundance Film Festival coming in 2 weeks, so that tends to shut down a lot of the normal city functions when we all go on to Sundance Film Festival mode. So we kind of pushed things back. And when I was thinking about this presentation, just so you can understand, I've been in the budget office for about 8 or 9 years. Been at the city almost 10 years. But we've been doing budget for outcomes. This will be our sixth budget process as we're starting right now. The first couple of years, it was pretty rough, I would say. And so I'll probably talk about that a little bit. But the last 3 or 4 years, it's been a lot better. And I think it's just because we've kind of established the culture and we've gotten into a certain rhythm with the budget process that we didn't really have before, because it was just, we were changing things. We were changing the how we were talking about things. We were changing how we were looking at the data and looking at the budget. One thing that, I have, we have our own way of doing it, I would say. And I know that Dr. Walters has talked in the past about budgeting for outcomes. And I've actually taught about budgeting for outcomes myself at the GFOA conference, Government Finance Officers Association conference, with a guy from Lincoln, Nebraska. He's the chief of staff there. His name's Rick Hopp, and he worked directly with the mayor. And so they do a budgeting for outcomes process. They have a very similar government, form of government that you guys have here. I've also worked a lot with our software company that we partner with, and we've developed a certain application that's called Ford that helps in kind of grease the wheels in this process, because it can become very complicated, very complex. I'm not really going to go into any like the software technical side for this presentation, just because I leave that up to more of the budget guys, the finance people. But I just wanted you to kind of understand where my background experience is with this. And a lot of, my research has come from, like I referenced GFOA. It's a best practice, Government Finance Officers Association. ICMA, I think a lot of you are familiar with that, the International City Managers Association. It's the best practice for them as well. So there's a lot of literature, a lot of research on it from those two organizations. And then there's another nonprofit called the Center for Priority-Based Budgeting. I've been to their conference 3 or 4 times. I've talked to them many times and used them as a resource as well. That's where really, if I had to kind of synthesize everything that we're doing, they do a process that's called priority-based budgeting, and that's really what we mimic our process off of. Even though we call it budgeting for outcomes, it's kind of more like a priority-based budgeting. Anyway, the thing is, obviously, we want a budget to have good fiscal health. So when you're looking at your budget, you can actually say that you're checking off fiscal health indicators. And I think one of the best ways to do that, just more in like a holistic way, is making sure you're tying your council priorities, your council goals to the budget. And that seems, I don't know, to me it seems fairly obvious that you would do that. I mean, everyone would do that. But then actually applying a systematic approach that you can actually see how your council goals, your council priorities are transcending down into the budget process. And you can see that in the budget document. You can see that in the day-to-day operations. That's what I'm going to talk about here. As Nate pointed out, you have all these programs that are prioritized. They're costed out, and then they're scored. And they can be scored by council. They can be scored by the community. They can be scored by staff. And it's a way to evaluate all these different programs and make a decision on how well they fit within council's goals and council's priorities. And the other thing I like, and Nick pointed this out, is it gives you a real holistic view of the budget. I think a lot of times, the budget is this big beast, and year to year, you kind of just want to tweak it. That's the easiest thing to do, is just incrementally tweak here and there because it's so big. There's so many things going on. And just as an example, our police budget's about $7 million. And, if you're the lay citizen person coming in and trying to understand, if you're just looking at a line item budget, it can be really difficult to understand what makes up all of those different line items. So budgeting for outcomes comes in, and we separate out the police budget into these different programs. So we have traffic mitigation, patrol operations, dispatch, drug enforcement, alcohol enforcement, these types of things. And we have a cost associated with all these different programs. And that way we can evaluate it against the other programs, all of which could be in the general funds or in different funds as well. Also, a big part of it is performance accountability. So each one of those programs has a performance piece to it. And I'll get into that a little bit later. And then, as Nate pointed out, transparency. I think that's one of my favorite things about it, is that you can actually point to the document and say, here's the goals, and here's how we're accomplishing those goals. So it's a pretty quick and dirty plan that you can just kind of see that progression. This is our strategic plan, roadmap, I would call it. So we start out with the strategic plan up here, and this is really focused or informed by the community vision values. So about 5 or 6 years ago, we sat down with our community, with our strategic partners, and we hashed out what were the community values that we were concerned about. What is it that really made Park City Park City? Things like small town, a natural setting, historic character. These were some of those values, and that informed then our council goals. And we have 4 council goals, and then that bleeds into our desired outcomes, and that bleeds into the strategic plans, and we have separate strategic plans for each of the goals. And then from those strategic plans, we have departmental business plans, and then we have the budget process. Another way of looking at it, something like this, which might be a little bit easier. So again, we start with the community vision. That informs the council goals. Again, I'm talking about this in terms of just, I know that you guys have talked about this already, but I know that there's 3 new council members, and so I'm not sure if they've been informed of all this stuff. So I'm just kind of giving the background a little bit, if that's okay. Community vision, council goals, you come up with your strategic plan and desired outcomes. Those inform the programs and services that goes into the budget. And then you have these checks on how well these are doing with performance measures and benchmarks. So just to go back a little bit, and okay, well, what are council goals? Because that's the other thing, is every community, every organization has kind of a different way of looking at what are our goals. For us, these are high level, and they're overarching reasons the organization exists in the eyes of the community. Now, I'm assuming that Provo City has these goals already. So I'm not saying you need to redo these or anything like that. They should remain consistent and unchanged over time. You have new council members, different needs, different opinions, but the goals should remain the same over time as much as possible. And they should be comprehensive. So everything that the city is doing should be included in those goals. That the services that are provided by the city can look back and they can link back to those goals. So these are Park City's goals right here. Preserving, enhancing natural environment, world-class, multi-seasonal resort destination, an inclusive community, diverse economic and cultural opportunities, responsive, cutting-edge, and effective government. When we first did budgeting for outcomes, the city actually had 8 goals. So this is one of those kind of wrinkles in our system. So we started this about 6 years ago. Council decided to narrow it down to 4 goals. Personally, I'd probably rather have 5 or 6 because I think there's a complexity there that I'd be a little bit more comfortable with. But the 4 goals work, and we can point back to all the services and how they kind of tie to those goals. This is an example of other, just in my research, and like I said, I've gone to a lot of different conferences. Just an example of a lot of the other, several cities, Boulder, Sacramento, their major goals or priorities. And one thing that I think is interesting is they all have good governance, efficient government as one of their goals. Park City, responsive, cutting edge, and effective government. That's one of ours as well. It's just interesting that over time, a lot of the goals for a community end up being kind of the same, but there's a nuance there once you get past the main goals. Safe community, across the board. And that makes sense. It's fairly obvious. Okay, so once you have those goals, then in the literature, it talks about developing strategy maps. So this is an example of one strategy map based off of preservation of Park City character. And actually, you'll notice this was a goal that we used to have, and they changed the goal when we had 8 goals before and went to 4. From this goal, we developed what are called key factors. And these key factors are natural setting, small town, sense of community, and historic character. Now, again, there's a lot of different ways that you could come up with these strategy maps. The strategy maps basically give council an idea and a sense of the detail behind what's in a goal. Because the goal can't just be, this overarching goal that's very ambiguous and there's no kind of real sense as to what it is. You have to kind of, devil in the details a little bit. You got to get down into it, the nitty gritty. So this is the first attempt at that. And it's really more of a brainstorming session to really get into what makes up that goal. So you can start building strategies and get into a budget with it. These aren't things that for us we use now, and maybe we should use them a little bit more, but from this we actually developed a strategic plan. And so this was really more of a brainstorming session. And we did it within our own staff first. So we had 8 different committees that got together, and each of these committees, for this one you had a lot of building, planning, engineering type staff, community development that were working on developing the key factors as well as the kind of details behind that. From that, we were able to develop a strategic plan. Now, the strategic plan for each of these goals has desired outcomes in them. And we have about 40 desired outcomes at the city. Each one of the desired outcomes fits into one of those council goals. Again, it's a more detailed explanation of what council is looking for. We call it the what, and they're guideposts for helping council as well as staff kind of make funding and planning decisions. So this is an example. Again, we have those 4 goals. So one of our goals is preserve and enhance the natural environment. So we have desired outcomes. And they're just little phrases that get to what council is really thinking about. And right now, actually, one of the things I'm going to be working with council on over the next couple of months is going through and prioritizing these. So this is something that we haven't done in the past that I think needs to happen. And the reason that we're doing it now is just because I want greater connectivity between council's desired outcomes and what we're doing in the budget process. We know what council wants, but then we want them to actually prioritize these and give us a better sense of what do they value over, what do they not value as highly. And these could change every year. So the 4 council goals, so you have preserve and enhance the natural environment, that's going to be consistent with the community for years to come. But then the desired outcomes, how do we get to that? Those things could change. And that's something that during our council retreats, I want to talk to council about and update those and review them annually. Here's another one, world-class multi-seasonal resort destination, inclusive community, diverse economic cultural opportunities, and then responsive, cutting-edge, and effective government. So these are the desired outcomes. Okay, again, once we get into those 4 council goals, we have a strategic plan. We call them biennial strategic plans because we have a 2-year budget process. Do you guys do a 1-year budget process? So we do 2 years, and we're starting. We're going to be starting our first year. So for July 1st will be the beginning of our 2-year budget. So we're starting that process right now. Again, the strategic plans, they describe the strategies. They provide a 2-year horizon for the strategic direction of the city. And really what they look like is kind of a little bit of a newsletter. It's something that we update annually for council. It includes action items, trends. It has key performance indicators in it, challenges that we're looking at, and also kind of budget highlights. And it's just really just nice little pamphlet that they can pick up and we can give to citizens, to constituents, whoever it is, and just say, here's the goal, here's how it's getting accomplished, in a very kind of easy to read manner. An example. This is actually, I was going to bring some down and I forgot, but this is the first page of one right here. So you have the desired outcomes in it. You got a description of what success is for this goal, key strategies, and then there's a bunch of other stuff in there, like I talked about. Okay, budgeting for outcomes. So, as you can tell, a lot of budgeting for outcomes is really just marrying the strategic plan to your budget. So I talked a lot about our strategic plan in very general terms, and then it has to link up to the budgeting process. Budgeting for outcome programs are the foundation, really, of the budgeting for outcomes process. It's the building blocks that kind of, make up what is the budget for the next 2 fiscal years. The program, we have about 140 programs, and this is something else that they talk about at a lot of these conferences, is how many programs should you have? Because you don't want to get in a situation where you're creating, thousands of programs, and then you're trying to figure out the budget for all of them. So there's a sweet spot, I think, in terms of how big or how small the program should be. I like where we're at right now. Our programs have gone up a little bit over the last several years. But, as you go through the process, your programs get better defined. Some programs fall by the wayside. They might not get funding.
Could you give an example of a program?
Yeah, sure.
Consider a program.
Well, just like I was talking about in police, so instead of just thinking about the police budget, we'll have something called traffic mitigation.
That's a program.
That's a program. Yeah. So within that program, we'll have budget, obviously, so we'll have a dollar amount. We'll have how many FTEs, full-time, part-time. We'll also have a description of what the program is. We'll have performance measures, how well that program is doing. We'll have a score. That'll be part of it, which I haven't got into very much. How does this program score compared to the other programs? Yeah, and so it's really like a 1 or 2 page memo, depending on how big the program is. And all of those, we call them offer sheets or bids, end up in the budget document. So we have this budget document full of these offers. Just for example, the budget department, obviously I'm more familiar with the budget department. We have 7 programs, I believe, and so within, which might be a little bit too many, quite frankly, but we've got debt management, capital budgeting, the operating budget, strategic planning, analysis resource, performance measures. Anything else on this? Grants. Oh, grants, yeah. So within the budget department itself, we have about 7, I believe. And there's a lot of different ways that you can cut up the budget, and that is what I would say is one of the biggest challenges initially. Now that we've got the programs established, we can use those, year in and year out, and we can change them, like I said, every year. I'm working with our water department to probably overhaul theirs right now. But by and large, we have a really good sense of what these programs are. And the programs really are just services that the city's providing.
If you don't have this, you can't really do budget development.
I don't think so, no. I mean, you could do, elements of it, I guess, but this is kind of the basis of it. These are the building blocks of budgeting for outcomes. Okay, so what else is included in these BFO programs? They can be in one department or they can be in multiple. We have our biggest program actually is special events, and at some point we decided special events needs to be its own program, and we don't have a department like a special events department. And so we decided we wanted to be able to catalog all these special events and how much time police officers or administrative staff or public works is spending time on special events. And so we had each department that was involved in special events carve out a niche of their budget to explain this 10%, 15% of their time is going towards special events. From that, we're able to combine all that and to make that into one BFO program called special events. That way we can take it to council and we can talk about special events in one sense rather than, it's like 5 or 6 departments that are impacted by all, when Park City has a lot of special events over the course of a year. And so we want to be able to talk with council about it and say, is this the appropriate level of service that we want for special events? Ends up being almost $1 million, I believe. Mostly, though, the programs kind of stay within the departments. There are some times that it makes sense to combine. So we'll have what we call cross-departmental. I think out of the 140 programs, we have about 15 of the programs that are actually combined with other departments. It's easier to keep it within. Part of this process is really kind of breaking down silos. But sometimes, those silos exist for a reason. And so when you're presenting to council or to our budget committee, which I'll go into, sometimes it's easier if you just have that one person talking about it. So that is one of the challenges, I would say. But I do like how it's set up, and we do have it, the ability to have cross-departmental programs. Because then you can also look for efficiencies within those programs, too. Because if you have 2 departments that are doing something that's very similar, the question is, maybe one of the departments doesn't need to do it, or you can de-emphasize something if you see kind of a redundancy happening there. So that's what I would say is one of the efficiencies that's gained by doing budgeting for outcomes. Okay, something else. The program itself will describe how it's meeting council's goals and desired outcomes. That's a big part of it. If you think of it like an RFP process or request for proposal, council is really putting out an RFP. This is what we want. These are our desired outcomes. And staff is responding to that. Staff is saying, this is how we can meet that desired outcome. Here's our proposal. With the money that they already have. Or in some cases, they're asking for an increase or something. In some cases, they could be asking for a decrease, but that like never happens. That's always my hope. That someone's going to come in and say, "Hey, we can do this for less money." And actually, we have had that happen, but usually it's us telling them, "I think you can do this for less money. So let's look at this." But usually they're not proposing that. I don't know why. It's weird. They also, okay, so they explain the scope of the service and any enhancements or decrease to the level of service. I mean, that's another big part of it. This is why actually that staff at first, another challenge is staff at first to be hesitant to want to do something like this because it's a lot of work initially because they have to go through and kind of reevaluate all the programs they're doing. But what I've noticed over time, as we've been doing this for a while, is staff likes this process because then they have the opportunity to really explain everything that they're doing. They get their day in the sun to justify these programs that they put their heart and soul into. They also can explain demands that's happening. Right now, we have a lot of building activity going on, so our building department, we're seeing building permits, plan checks, going through the roof, and they have an opportunity within the VFO program to explain that and explain how not only their program connects to the desired outcomes, but explain the pressures that they're experiencing right now, and then take that to this committee, which I'll explain a little bit. Kind of what I was explaining before, it includes expenditures. Oh, another big piece is these can include revenues. So another big part of budgeting for outcomes that I liked, which we weren't really doing before, was we were tying, we were creating these programs and these services. We were showing the expenses, but we're also showing if they were generating revenues. That way we're looking at it in terms of like maybe like a return on investment, or is it what level of service should we be providing? What's the cost for this? What's the net increase here that we're experiencing? So a good example is our recreation programs. We have pretty prolific recreation programs at Park City, and it's easy, I think, in a certain light to say these aren't core services. For Park City, they make the argument that it is a core service, and I can make that argument. But when we evaluate them against, like public safety, police, our transit system, our streets, these types of things, it's easy to look at recreation and go, well, it's hard to kind of look at you guys and say that this is a necessary thing that we need to do at the city. However, what if they're holding their own and their revenues that they're bringing in, like a tennis program, are actually paying for that tennis program itself? Well, that's something that we take into account when we're making the recommendation on what the budget should be. If there's a revenue associated with it, how can we get rid of it? Because then we're losing the revenue too. Also, within the program, cost savings they can talk about. If they're able to innovate and come up with a way to save money, if they're able to collaborate. Performance measures are a key part of this as well. So each one of the programs, 140 programs, has performance measures tied to it. All right, so now I'll go into more of the, I'll go to the logic model here really quick. Just to talk a little bit about performance measures. So this is a logic model, and logic models are something that a lot of organizations will use to get to the desired outcome. But if we're kind of looking at it more philosophically, we have the community outcomes, so those are the desired outcomes that we're looking for. That's the what. What is it that we want? And that's built around why we exist as a community. Why? What are our values? Once we figured out the why, then we go to the what, which is the community outcomes. Those are the goals, the priorities. That leads into the how. How is it that we're going to get what we want? So then you start, strategizing as part of your strategic plan. That leads into the program outcomes. So these are the BFO programs that we've developed. The program outcomes are answering that question of, are we producing the right services that council and the community want. That's the budgeting for outcomes process. On top of that, then you have outputs. Outputs are measuring the effectiveness or the efficiency of that program. Is that program doing well compared to the other ones? Now, the tricky part here, there is some literature talking about performance-based budgeting. That kind of was all the rage 10, 15 years ago. The problem with performance measures when you're budgeting is that if a program is not doing well, for example, Park City obviously has a very robust streets snow plowing system. If they're not meeting their targets, the big question is, what do we do then? How do they need more funding, or should we take funding away from them? If we take funding away from them, are their targets actually going to get worse? Are their performance measures going to get worse? So it's this really kind of complex question, because if you were in the private sector and you were producing some kind of product and it wasn't performing well, the easy thing to do would be to yank the product. We're not going to do that one anymore. It's a bust. But when you're providing services to the community, you can't just stop doing snow plowing. You have to do that. So that's why performance measures have to be part of the conversation, but it's really more of an art than a science. And that's, my opinion on performance measures. Lastly, once you have the outputs and the outcomes, you go to the inputs. This is where you're developing your budget, the allocation of resources. Once you've figured out what your outcomes are, what your the programs that you want to accomplish, then you have to allocate or determine how much of your resources, and that's not just budget, that's staff time, that's materials and equipment. How much time do we want to talk to city council about these things? So those are the inputs. And that's the kind of the BFO process, more on a theoretical, philosophical level. Okay, so this is a graphic that I like, where it's kind of talking about maybe that RFP process, where you have, in this case, this isn't ours, this is more of just an example. You have these 5 council goals. So this goal over here is called Community Values, Arts, Culture, Recreation. So within that goal, then, you're going to have all these offers. So we have 1, 2, 3, 6 offers. And those offers are going to be the BFO programs. They're connecting what they do to the overarching goal of the city. So this is just one example over here, but all of these other goals will have offers associated with them as well. For us, we'd have 140 for Park City. Okay, so now to kind of get more into how we're actually doing this in terms of, kind of more of the technical side and the workflow. So we start out the year, like you guys are, with we reaffirm our goals and desired outcomes. So we establish what those goals are. We have strategy meetings, and we talk about it, and we set the agenda for the next year or two. We talk about long-term vision. We also talk about what is it that council is really concerned about right now. So you're talking about long-term and short-term over the next couple of years. Again, for us, we're biennial budget, so we're thinking about the next 2 years. From those meetings, managers cost out, score, and report on those BFO programs. So they're actually going through and tying what they're doing to the council's desired outcomes. So we'll be doing that over the next couple months with our managers. Now again, the first time you do this, this is where a lot of the work comes into play. Costing out and developing these programs is really hard. It could take 6 months to a year probably to do this. So you have to do it outside of your regular budget process, leading up to the budget process, I would say. Then the budget department, us, we come in and we act as kind of a liaison between the department managers as well as a budget congress that we put together that evaluates all of these things. When we're doing it, when managers are developing their budgets, they only do this once a year, and so they always kind of forget. Some of them forget how to do it. So we have to go in and kind of help them. And kind of grease the wheels and make sure that they're doing it well. We're also helping them, when they're developing these offers. A lot of the offers depend on how well they're talking about it. Some are better than others, so that's another kind of pitfall: is how well are you going through and explaining and justifying your needs. If you're not doing it very well, that could come back to haunt you. So we help them with that. We kind of act as a consultant. Then we have this results team, which I'll talk a little bit more in-depthly about. And the results team meets for a couple of months. For us, it's, we start in February, go through March, beginning of March, or sorry, the end of March, beginning of April. And the results team, and I'll explain a little bit about the results team in the next couple of slides, but the results team is basically this budget congress that's made up of staff that evaluates these 140 programs and looks at their scoring, changes the scoring if necessary, and then recommends funding. The recommendation of the funding goes to our city manager. So in this case, I would see that as maybe going to the mayor, to the chief administrative officer of the city. And the city manager or the mayor can make any tweaks or changes that they want. That's part of their job that they go through, and they evaluate all these things just as much as the committee. They get a real good sense of what it is that this committee is recommending. From those conversations, then you go into the recommended budget that goes to the city council, and you deliberate and talk about that. Look at it for however long it needs to be looked at, and come to a decision and adopt the budget. So, and then we do that between May and June. I'm assuming it's similar here. The other thing is, I can give you guys these slides if you want to, if you're interested. Okay, so let me talk about the results team a little bit. This is more on the technical side, but I wanted to kind of go in and explain. If you're not doing a results team, it can be kind of a weird thing to look at and to talk about if you're used to doing it in a certain way. So again, the results team, they're looking at each of these BFO programs. They act as the buy agents. You can have managers. We have a bunch of managers, but we also have non-managers. That's something that we like to do. We consider them high performers. Typically, they're mid-level managers or people that are trying to get a leg up maybe in the city, but they're very ambitious individuals usually. What's nice about that is these meetings take a long time. A lot of times the managers are busy doing a lot of other stuff, so it's nice to have some people that can, if they have the bandwidth, to kind of focus on the results team. So we'll have kind of a nice mix between managers and kind of the mid-level managers. We also have representatives from throughout the city. So we have, Park City does it a little bit differently, where we don't have a traditional hierarchy in our city. We have what are called self-managed teams. We have 6 of these teams. Nate and I sit on the internal services team. And we also have community development, sustainability, public works, public safety, public utilities, library and recreation. And these teams will all have one representative. So they'll pick, usually it's one of these people, usually a manager or non-manager, that will represent them on the team. That way you have kind of a nice equity throughout the organization. And I've been doing this, again, this will be my 6th year doing it. I've been doing it for a while. And what I like about it is at first in your initial meetings, it can be a little bit turfy because you want to represent your team. But as the meetings go on and as it progresses over the several weeks that you're meeting, you end up with managers and staff that really get a better view of the city and all the pressures from these different departments. And it's kind of nice because you end up having kind of a mini budget committee that understands some of the pressures that you're dealing with, trying to figure out how to fund all these different services from throughout the city. So I've had a really good experience on it, where it hasn't been political and it hasn't been turfy, but that is obviously one concern that I would raise. So I think establishing some good guidelines for that committee beforehand is integral. Part of the idea is to challenge the status quo, encourage innovation, new ideas. Obviously, you're trying to link these bids to the desired outcomes. They vet the manager's budget submissions. The other thing is that they're going to look at the scoring. So I talked a little bit about scoring. I'll go more into detail about how the scoring actually works. But how we do it at Park City, and you can do it in different ways, but we actually have the managers go through a list of criteria, and they'll actually score their own programs based off of these criteria. The results team will go through and evaluate those scores. In most cases, they'll bring them down to get them into more, of a normal level. And those are the scores that we look at when we're making budget recommendations for each of those programs. It's important they take ownership of the process and that they present a united recommendation. Okay, so just to talk a little bit more about the scoring, because this, again, is one of the unique aspects of budgeting for outcomes. We have the 4 council goals. So when they're developing the programs and they're defining and justifying the program, we're talking about the council goals as well as the desired outcomes. I'm kind of showing it in kind of a higher level here, but that'll be one of the criteria, and that one for us is worth about 2 points. So each of the criteria are actually weighted. Then we'll have these other what are called basic program attributes. So it's not just the council goals, but there's these other things that you have to think about when you're developing your budget. How much, and these could be tailored to whatever the results team or council wants. These have changed for us several times over the course of these 6 years. They haven't changed in the last couple of years, and I'm not planning to change them this year. But you have portion of community served. If you have a program that only serves a small part of the population, you have to evaluate whether or not how much you want to fund it. The reliance on the city to provide the program.
So how would you give less than 1.0 then if it's not a lot of the community that's served?
Well, okay, so these are the weights. The scoring is actually right here. It's 0 through 4.
Okay.
Yeah. Good question, though. That's not very clear on this slide. Reliance on the city to provide a program. This gets into whether or not this program exists outside of the organization. So an example, I talked a little bit about snowplowing. No other entity or no other organization is doing snowplowing in Park City, so that one's going to score high. But our recreation programs, we have private recreation programs. That service is being provided. Now, it might be provided at different levels. It might cost more. These are all part of the consideration, but it is being provided. Some programs might have nonprofits that do these types of things. So that's part of our evaluation process. Change in demand. Like I talked about building activity. For us, building activity is going through the roof right now. So there's a huge demand, and that comes into account when we're looking at whether or not we want to add funding to it. Mandated. Is this something that's required? Is it federal law required? Is the state code required? Do we require it ourselves? Is it part of the municipal code? We have to take that into consideration when we're making decisions. Effectiveness of the proposal. That's where the performance measures come in. So that's one piece of the criteria that we're looking at. How well is that program doing? Is it meeting its targets? I talked a little bit about this before. Cost recovery of the program. That's the revenues. Is it breaking even? Is the cost recovery horrible? Is there a grant provided for this program? If there's a grant, why would we cut it? Because it's paying for itself. Is it in a different fund, an enterprise fund that has a revenue source? So that's another wrinkle to this. And then lastly, just cost savings and innovation. Is there something that they're explaining, some kind of cost savings for that next fiscal year? So going back to this, each one of these criteria then will be scored from the program is essential or critical to, which is number 4, to 0. Program has no influence on achieving that result. Then I don't know if you guys can see this, but this is an example of 2 different programs: street and sidewalk maintenance, cleanup and storm drain. These are both in the streets department. They have the weighting of the criteria over here, and then you plug in your score from 0 to 4 on how well it's doing, and then that'll give you your total score for that criteria, and then your total score for the program down here. So this one ends up as a 22, this one ends up as a 20. And that way we have a way to evaluate each one of these programs by these scores. Again, these criteria can be whatever the city wants them to be. This is what we've we've talked to our council, and they've bought off on these too. So okay, so again, it's about putting your money where your mouth is. Once we've established the scoring system, the score for each one of these programs, we can put it into a quartile. So if it scores really high, it'll end up in quartile 1. Scores a little bit lower, quartile 2, and then quartile 3, quartile 4. So for last year, for our fiscal year 14 budget, this was the 20 million was the total for the previous fiscal year on quartile 1. So most of our programs were in quartile 1. We were putting the budget and our resources to the things that we valued the most. Then you can see quartile 2 is a little bit less, quartile 3 a little less, and then 4. Then that's the blue, and then the red is the net change. So the results team was making a recommendation on where to put the funding, and we were putting the funding mostly in quartiles 1 and 2. That way we were, taking the limited resources that we had and had a net increase because we were also decreasing in some cases programs and putting that where council and the community valued them the most. And you can see quartile 4 still ended up with some funding. So it's not like everything in quartile 4 goes away, and we still increased it based off of, some of these factors. Because the other thing I should mention is the scoring is really the kind of guideline to help you make funding decisions, because there's a lot of nuances, a lot of complexity to what's going on at the city at the time. So we don't necessarily just draw a line and say and cut it off and go, okay, we're not going to do everything in quartile 4 now and do everything in quartile 1. For example, public safety tends to score pretty high. It meets a lot of those criteria, but it doesn't mean that everything that they're asking for will score high. So we have to take that into account. We have to evaluate it and really make decisions as a committee, as this budget Congress, as to whether or not we value what they're asking for. That's the art versus the science. Because it's not just set up for scoring. It's based off of intuition. It's based off of how well you think they're defending that program. So you have to kind of make a lot of those decisions, but you make it as a team. Okay, now we're going to go in a little bit into the capital process.
Yeah, I won't talk too much about capital. I'll just have a few slides here.
I just mentioned that if anybody wants, there are galoshes and juice and snacks in the back of the room. Please help yourself, and feel free to stand up and stretch your legs as you like. We'll take periodic breaks, but please feel free to move out of time.
What we've done with the capital is we've tried to. One of the issues that we had, and we'll probably get this more in the Q&A, is what some of the difficulties that we had were. And one of those was, how do you do this? The first couple of years we were doing it in Excel spreadsheets, which proved to be kind of a nightmare in a way. And so after doing that a couple of years, we really went back to council and said, is this a process that you value? Are you getting value out of this budgeting for outcomes process? They were pretty resounding yes. And so at that point we said we need to figure out a way to make this more manageable for the budget department, but also for all the managers who are putting these bids all together and scoring them and all that. On the capital side, we had a capital budget process that was the same way, but once we had that software, we integrated it into there, and what I've tried to do in the last couple of years is tie those capital projects as much to the council goals in the same way that we do on the operating budgeting for outcomes side. So we do the same thing where we have a criteria that we go through and we evaluate each project. We obviously don't need to put them in programs because the projects themselves kind of his programs. But we have our own weighting system and same scoring system, just a weighting system that's customized to projects as opposed to services. They all tie to the same four goals and council's desires. So we can take the entire budget, operating and capital, and tie those all back to this is how much money we're putting into these four key goals that you're doing. You know, when we end up doing that based on those scores, we get a huge sheet. This is only, you know, 1 page out of 4, where we actually have gone through and scored every one of those projects based on how they rank in those criteria to council goals. We separate them out by these are the competitive funding. These are things that if you can't, you know, cut this project, you can fund this project. These are ones that are within an enterprise fund, and then these are ones that are basically funding dedicated to that. So you've issued a DO bond or you have a grant. Basically, you can't cut that program because you then couldn't use that GO funding for something else. So we separate it out by score and then also by funding flexibility. And through that, we can go to council and say, here is how this, what we call a CIP committee, which is made up of very similar to the Budget Congress, staff members who come and have scored all of those different projects. And we can go to council and say, this is how these match up. Same process, this is presented to the city manager. They make their executive decision on if they feel that this is where they are with the projects. Sometimes our city manager will make a couple of tweaks. There's a project that fell below the line that she feels needs to be funded. She can come back and say, this one needs to be prioritized but higher. And we can go back and adjust that based on the city manager's recommendation. So that would be the same as what the mayor might recommend here. And that's kind of how the capital ties in, and we follow as similar a process as we can to the budgeting for outcome side.
And so that doesn't involve the department heads. They're not the ones coming and asking for or giving.
Yeah, they are.
They are still.
They are. So a project manager or a department head would be presenting their operating budget, and then if they have capital needs, they would be presenting their capital needs in the form. So they're presenting both sides. And it's the same thing where we have a CIP committee that's made up of some department heads and then also some mid-level staff. So it's a good mix there. Because both the committees are going at the same time and they're so time consuming, we typically don't want someone to be on both committees, even though we have done that, but their time is basically for a couple of months. All they're doing is budget committees at that point. But that's kind of how we balance capital.
Great. So just a few more slides. Some of the things that you want to think about if you're going to go down this road is you have time. Obviously, I talked about this huge time commitment, especially up front. The first year would take a while. And kind of what Nate was talking about, the first couple years that we did this, we used Excel spreadsheets. But for us, that was a lot harder. We worked with the software company to develop this application that really helped us. But so the budget department, budget and finance have to be on board with it. And we do have time to figure out these strategy maps, the BFO programs. That can take several months. Give yourself at least 6 months. It might be up to a year. So it might be, this could be a multi-year kind of process. Do you have the talent? Do you have the people, that could get on these different committees to be able to make the recommendations? Is council on board? Is that something that council wants to do? Obviously, if you're going to council with a new budget process, it has to be, you have to have that relationship where you both want to do something like this. And I will say, actually, the very first year that we tried doing this, it came from the budget department. The budget department said, "Hey, we're reading all these best practices. We think we should do this." And we went. We tried to do this process, and it was kind of piecemeal. And we tried to get staff on board, and our city manager was kind of like, "Yeah, okay, yeah, that sounds good." But it really kind of crashed and burned. It didn't go. We really ended up doing a very similar process from the year before. Then what happened is our council actually went on what we call city tour. They go and they visit these other Western resort communities, I think they were they were somewhere in Colorado. Fort Collins. And Fort Collins was talking to them about budgeting for outcomes and saying how great it was. And they came back to us and they said, we should do budgeting for outcomes. We're like, well, we tried doing that last year. So there was a tremendous support from council at that point. And because of that, then, executive was on board and we all, worked together on this process. Obviously, you need support from the chief administrative official, from everyone kind of in those executive positions. Do you have the technology? I'm not going to go into any of the technological piece here, but it can, when you're taking a line item budget, and let's say your budget is this circle, it's like a pizza or something, and it's all cut in one way. You're really going through and you're kind of layering another, it's another level on top of it, and you're cutting it in a completely different way. Doing that might sound simple, but it's really complex, and it can mess up your budget. So you got to make sure that those systems are in place beforehand, or at least start thinking about that kind of stuff, because it could change your budget document, which that was tied into our technology before. We were using Excel and these things called crystal reports. So we had to redo and rethink all of our budget processes and figure out ways to automate things, tied into our HR system, to the accounting system. There's a lot that goes into that. I have lots of slides on that, but I'm not going to show any of those. Can your organization deal with the change? Communication strategy, just the art versus the science. Again, none of this is really scientific. It's more logical in nature, I would say. But you're definitely dealing with personalities on the results team, and just trying to get a good mixture there of applying kind of a foundation and a structure to your process, but also realizing that nothing's perfect and you can't get it to always fit, exactly into the scoring and everything like that. That there's going to be these other different pressures that you're not even thinking about. Get the council brought in early. Determine the level of outside help you need. We never had consultants or anything like that, but like I said, I went to a lot of different trainings myself and Nate to understand how this thing would work. I would recommend bringing in these guys called the Center for Priority-Based Budgeting. They're great. We don't necessarily use them, but I've been to a lot of their trainings. Build off the existing systems that you already have. That's a big piece. I'm assuming you already have a performance measurement system. You already know a lot of the systems. You already have council goals and priorities. You don't have to start from ground zero. You can develop and kind of morph into the budget for outcomes process. Put the best and the brightest on the teams and challenge the status quo. So everyone, I think, has to understand their role in this, and I have a lot of slides on the different roles between elected officials, results team, and departments. But I kind of talked about that briefly. Again, going back to programs, the programs are the foundation, the building blocks for this process. It's not really budgeting for outcomes, I don't think, if you're not developing programs. And you want to be clear and understand your results. Okay. So, again, thanks for the time. I love this stuff. I geek out about it. I've talked to a lot of different cities about it, actually, probably half a dozen. It's something that I'm proud of. If you have questions, if you don't have questions, that's fine too.
I have lots of questions, and I just do want to mention that a couple members of our budget committee are here, Lauren Walters and Mr. Armand, that I mentioned before, and welcome your questions as well. I want this to be open discussion, question answer process, and administration. Please feel free to ask questions.
You always don't know that doesn't move on.
Yeah, and, so yeah, please feel free to ask questions. I want this to be open and be able to get as much information as we can. So, Mr. Smith.
Can you pull up that slide showing your 4 council goals?
Well, I think I can flip through it pretty quick. Well, let's see. So I think they had them on.
Right there is good enough. So, do you remember what they used to be? I mean, you're down to 4. you remember some of the others?
We had one, for example, that was safe community, and you can see that that one is not on here.
A lot of those goals, so when they took the 8 goals, they didn't just get rid of the other ones.
Yeah,
they
they
actually kind
combined
of
them.
combined them all in. So most of the goals are in there. It used to be like, especially the inclusion of a diverse economic and cultural opportunity. That one was kind of broken out, where you had like historic preservation as a goal.
Historic preservation was one.
Economic development was a goal. So most of them.
Yeah, so this one was like 3 different goals. Transportation, I believe, was one of the goals.
So I look at that, you're talking about your environment.
Yeah.
You're talking about your business community, which is your resort destination. You're talking about your government being cost effective. And then you're talking about the community, the cultural and economic viability of the community itself. We've got a Vision 2030, which has a lot of different things that we try to talk about, everything important. And I'm sure that's kind of what you did, and then you made this transition so you could kind of focus in a different way. So it's not like you've necessarily left anything out, but you've just chosen these 4 focal points.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. We didn't necessarily change the direction of the city. We just chose a different way to talk about it. That we wanted to really be able to talk to the community about it in a very simplified format rather than the 8 goals were a little cumbersome. I'd say a couple of the goals really, I think one was regional collaboration, which is kind of ingrained in a lot of the other goals. It's part of who we are. So that was kind of the morphing of that. And I would say that that was tricky at first because, you kind of ask yourself, well, are we really, if we're changing our goals, then aren't we changing who we are and where we're going? But the reality was we were just kind of rebranding in a way.
As you're evaluating between programs, and you go from one year to another, and I would assume that a program that may have been funded last year may not be funded this year. And so as you're evaluating those, typically what happens when you eliminate a program is with cities, a large part of the expenses is usually related to payroll. And so you get situations where you had to lay people off because it's not a program that was funded up last year that's not this year, whereas your program evaluation has been based more on new funding and where that new funding is directed. So you can just share a little bit your experience and how that's worked.
Sure. And
I'm John Morgan. I'm the Director of Administrative Services.
okay. It was very technical questions. That's what I thought. You're probably coming from that side. Yeah, and again, I'm not really talking a lot about the nuances and the details of it, but that's a great question because that's where it gets really messy, right? Is you have these programs, and in theory, you could have some of these programs that end up on these bottom quartiles that go away. We ended up in a situation where we have eliminated some of these programs. Most of the time, the ones that we've eliminated, it was because it was pretty obvious that we needed to get rid of them, and it was staff that they were either going to retire or it was kind of it was part-time, so it was easy to kind of get rid of them. But really, you're taking programs and you're dividing out people's time. So I talked about like the budget department, and we have these 7 different programs. But what if we got rid of, performance measurement? Does that mean that, I get like, a 10th less of my pay or something because that's going away? And the answer to that is it's depends. For us, over the course of the last 5 or 6 years, we started doing this because of the recession, and so we haven't really been in a cutting mode. So we haven't been in a situation where we've actually had to slash budgets. So we just have these small budget increases. We take that 10-year projection. We're looking at the revenues. We say we can increase this much, and so we've been able to mostly retain our programs. However, like I said, when I was talking to or working with the chief of staff for Lincoln, Nebraska, and I was teaching at GFOA with him, he said that they started this during the recession, and they ended up having to fire a lot of people. And what they did was they were able to to rehire them in some of these upper quartiles. And so they were able to take some of those resources from these quartiles and move them into the other quartiles. Now, again, that's really simplified, but working through that is just part of the, it's kind of a case-by-case basis. So for us, we haven't had to do it too much, but I imagine once we hit hard times or we get in a situation where we have to get rid of programs, you have to make that decision. Maybe it's 1 employee, maybe it's 10 employees. Hey, we're not going to do this program anymore. Does that mean that we fire them? Or does that mean that we reallocate their resources to a different place and maybe look at rehiring them? That doesn't mean they all get rehired. But that is, those are some of the tough questions, I guess.
I think you mentioned that your fiscal year starts in July.
Yeah.
So that's maybe one of the reasons why you can push your goal setting to March. Or I'm wondering, or with the fact that you're on a 2-year cycle, I guess my question is, can you do it on a 1-year cycle? Is the 2-year cycle preferable because of all the work that has gone into it?
Yeah.
Your decision in going to a 2-year cycle, and is it because of timing, or is it because of all the work that goes into it initially?
No, we've been doing a 2-year budget for a long time. So before we started budgeting for outcomes.
Okay.
So we do, a biennial budget. It doesn't have to be like that. We can do it annually, and we do it annually. We just do it less on the second year. So we come back and reevaluate. We don't rescore all the programs, for example. So we kind of do, it's like BFO light on the second year. But it's I've been at the city 10 years. We've never really done a true 2-year budget where we don't look at it again the second year. We have to. I mean, health insurance changes, pay changes, all these, inflationary components change. And so we have to kind of reevaluate.
The bulk of the work happens in the first year.
Yeah.
It's a little less.
It is a little less. It's not as much less as I would like.
But this wasn't the impetus for changing to a 2-year. You were already doing that. Okay.
Yeah, you can do it 1 year easily. And just, the kind of caveat to that is leading up to that year, I think, if you normally take, we take about 6 months before we adopt our budget. So we start, now through the end of June. And for getting this set up, you really have to start right after the budget is adopted, I would say. To start evaluating some of these programs and crafting those. It takes a long time to do that. So the lead up to the budget process is a lot lengthier the first year, the first couple of years, even maybe, but definitely the first year.
You had a six-step program there where you started off with that. I can see where the first one, right? That one. I can see the council very much involved in 1 and definitely 6. Where does the council fit in 2, 3, 4, 5?
The council could be more involved. For us, council feels that they want to set direction and tell us what the desired outcomes are and the overarching, outcomes that they want. But we don't include them on the results team. And they feel like they're okay with that. I have seen it in different cities where maybe we'll have some council, 1 or 2 council liaisons on the results team.
So you say on the
budget Congress and
on 4 and 5, they're not the budget department cleanups and present bids.
Yeah, I mean, this is more of the administrative stuff. This is working with the managers to develop the programs and the budget requests. This is us working with those managers. And then this is actually where the decision making starts coming in. So you have the budget Congress or the results team here. Then you have the city manager, decision making, and then you go to council to adopt the budget.
So basically, if I understand that, then the council is basically involved in 1 and 6, setting the goals, setting the vision, the priorities.
Yeah.
Okay, you guys, this is what we want. Go after that, and we work with the manager, the administration, the other departments.
Yeah.
And then they bring it back to us when we decide whether they met the goal.
Yeah, and this isn't like one meeting. This is over.
No, I'm sure it's over many meetings.
Yeah. For us, it's a couple months. Start in May, and then we adopt in June. So it's usually 6 or 7 meetings that we do that. So great on this.
question on 6 then. So what do you guys deliver to the city council? Do you deliver options to them, or is this a recommended budget? And what does the council come back with? What's a typical dialogue in that?
Well, we have a list of all the programs, and again, I didn't go into the specifics of the programs, but each one of the programs has up to 3 scenarios that you could adopt, or you could recommend for funding. We'll have a recommended one for each one of those programs, the ones that, the results seem as well as the city manager feels like should be adopted. And then the council can look at those, and they'll have all the documentation of what that department manager was requesting, and they can look at that and change that.
What are those 3? You said there's 3
scenarios? Yeah, so each program could have up to 3 scenarios. Most of the programs, they stay about the same except for inflationary increases. But if they're requesting funding and they have maybe different iterations of staffing requests or materials and supplies, then they could have up to 3 different ways to look at that. And that's something that the results team uses to make a recommendation. That way we're not just looking at A or B, we're looking at A, B, C. And even then, it's actually more complex than that because we'll go back and we'll negotiate with the managers back and forth, trying to get to exactly where we want it to be, because sometimes it's not just ABC, it's D, E, F. I mean, it could be all these different variations before you get to a comfortable place. Does that make sense? So council can get into the weeds in terms of those programs, but the reality is most of the time our council has liked the recommendations. They will make their own recommendations sometimes, and we'll take that into account and come back and we'll have maybe a new overarching recommendation. We've done that. A lot of times we focus on some of the bigger picture type things too. If there's a pay plan that year or health insurance, those types of things too, which actually are a separate part of this that I haven't really talked about too much. But
one of the things that I would add right there is that when you do go back with the recommended budget to council, and there is something where they say, well, there's a program here that I do want to see. I'm not sure if I want it to be an increased level of service, but can you tell me what it looks like? And since we have all those scenarios, it's really easy to go back and say, this is how much this would cost, this is what it would do to the overall recommended budget. And so having that all prepared makes it really easy within those 6 or 7 weeks that you're presenting to council, that you can actually still change the budget and come back to them with a balanced budget within the time period in the adopt. So there's a lot of flexibility built in.
yeah, and again, that goes back to the technological side too, where you have to come back, every council meeting and be able to kind of change things on the fly, and having kind of a system in place to help you with that is important.
Is it fair to say, though, that the structure of what you present to the council at 6 has changed radically? That you're now presenting 140 programs, and that there is linkages to the city's goals, and that there's a scoring mechanism that's all?
Yeah, I'd say it's a lot more intuitive. Anyone can pick it up and look at all the programs and what they cost. It's a book full of these bid offers rather than just all these line items. We still have some line items in the back because we kind of have to, but we're not. It's not as technical in nature anymore. It's a lot more strategic in nature because it's really talking in terms of services provided that are connected to council goals.
What's an example of one of those line items in the back? Like, that you can't quite go without. What's an example
of a line item?
Yeah.
Well, there's lots of different line items. You could have line items for utilities, training, books.
So that hasn't been rolled into one of the programs. Outside of the programs.
So each one of those line items still exist. That's the thing. You're not getting rid of your accounting structure. They're just now you're looking at it in a different light.
So the budget document is actually 2 parts of it. The first part is all the BFO, all the expenses are in that part. So you could read it that way, which is the transparent way. And then you could also go back to the way that you have to prepare a budget and see the department line items, revenues, expenditures, the way that the state mandates that all the cities do it. So you kind of say, do I want to look at it from the accountant side of view, or do I want to look at it from the program side of view?
Okay, thank you. I thought you were saying that beyond these programs, we haven't been able to get away from these line items. That you're saying that everything is listed both as in the program view as well as the line item view.
Yeah, they coexist.
Okay.
That's a good way to think about it. And I should have brought a budget document.
The special event, when Ed talked about how the special event was.
Oh, you have a copy of our budget document?
Yeah.
They're online.
Highlights that, because if you were to go back and figure out how much special events were from the line items, it would be all over the place. But you could go on the other side and say, okay, this is what it is. So that's kind of how it.
Yeah, I mean, talking about line items in a department that's, $7-8 million, it doesn't, to me, it's not very effective. We're talking about programs, so we're talking about the actual services, traffic mitigation, how much do traffic mitigation cost, how much do patrol officers cost, that type of thing. I think it's a better conversation.
So is that one budget, is it more like our PACA then, that it's just much more condensed and more easily read? What is,
PAPR is more just kind of a summarized version of our comprehensive annual financial report.
and so I wonder if that was what it's more like what he was talking about.
No, I mean,
It's a different thing.
Yeah.
It's more like their citizens budget. They use that citizens budget document. It's probably more like the PAFR in that respect.
Yeah, we have a CAFR as well, and we do that. Our finance department actually is in charge of that, but that's separate. I mean, that's all the CAFR. The way I always talk about budgeting versus accounting is the accounting. The CAFR is really looking at the last fiscal year. The budget document is looking at the next fiscal year or the next two, or in the CIT's case, we're looking. How do we go 10 years out?
We go 5 to 10 years.
5, 10, yeah. It's a financial planning document.
So you broke down all the city services programs into 140 different items?
Yeah.
Is that, could it be 150, could it be 130?
What's the good ratio?
Well,
the good number?
I guess it depends on how you wanted to look at things. And there was some choices at some point made, right?
Yep, definitely. So, let's see how I can describe this. There's, you don't want to be too small, because if you make it too small, then like the results team will have to look at a ton of different programs. I would say that if you're looking at, over 300 or 400, that's a lot. I know that, for a big city like Provo, I mean, you probably would have more programs, I would say. But you really just want to get in a comfortable place where you can talk about these services, where there is some, budget associated with them that isn't minuscule, but it's still not so big. Like I wouldn't include, for example, a whole department as a program. But that department should be divvied out. As to what that is, it really depends. I mean, that's where I say, like, a lot of this, it comes by way of the department managers. They'll have to recommend and say, well, actually, we do 3 main services that I want to talk about. And I think a good example, I'm working with our water manager. We have a water system, and he wants to redo his programs this year. He wants to simplify them and make them more easy to understand and more effective to his operations. He didn't develop them because he wasn't around. It was someone else that developed them. So he's going to go through and redo those. And that's a work in progress. Every year you can reevaluate those programs and change them and tweak them. I wouldn't recommend, starting from scratch every year, but giving the managers the opportunity to relook at those programs and change how they look.
So there's almost like 2 ways to look at it. You could approach the department heads and say, what is it you do? Break it out, and from their perspective, they see the world a certain way. But then from someone from the outside looking in, they may say, well, I want it broken into a little bit different, or maybe more of a breakdown. The council may want more detail.
Yeah. And we've had that happen where we've broken them out further because council requested it, saying this is too big, we need more understanding of what's going on. So we've taken one program and broken it into 2 or 3. like I said, it's kind of work in progress on the programs.
Health insurance would be a line item, right? Your insurances for your employees, who would look at that? Is that a program or is that something, who would look at making adjustments in that?
It's a great question, and I purposely didn't go into it, but I will explain my thoughts on it. So you have some inflationary pressures that are happening as well in addition. Really, when we're doing budgeting for outcomes, we're mostly looking at it in terms of departmental requests or project manager requests on the CIP side. But we have actually other committees that are looking at benefits, health insurance, and other benefits, as well as pay. These are some of these more inflationary things that are happening, and they have their own methodologies that are tied to council goals as well for how they do it. So we have to work together, me and Nate, HR, and we look at the total of the, how much money we have to spend, and our recommendations have to fit within that total. So the pay increase that may happen has to fit within the BFO, the results team increase, or the CIP increase. So we have to take that all into account. Great question.
Technical staffing question here is, you have, you're a budget office and finance is separate.
Yeah.
Accounting and then accounts receivable and all that.
Yeah.
And so there's a structural difference in your organization as well, a little bit. And you have how many people devoted just to the budget process?
Well, 4 in the budget department. And then we have, I would say, the results team, and everyone on that is pretty involved in that. We have about 6 to 8, depending on the year. And those are just, managers from other departments.
Just a related question.
Yeah.
The budget committee.
Why do you think they asked that question?
And that's, again, another thing they have to take into consideration. Do you have the bandwidth to do something like this? Because it is pretty complex and time consuming. But I think it's better at the end of the day. I think you get a better outcome and you have a transparency with the budget that you didn't have before. And I think you get better results too. Sorry, go ahead.
When you refer to the budget committee, is that a administrative committee, that department head committee, or is that another name for one of these committees, like the results team? You know what I'm saying? Do you use that interchangeably?
Sorry, yeah.
Or is it a separate committee?
I am. It's the same.
And who runs that committee, I guess, or organizes? Or
I do.
So it's the same thing as what? The budget committee is?
The results team.
Results team is the
Yeah.
same thing.
Yeah. But I'm sorry, I keep using those differently.
That's
Just because I like the term budget Congress. We don't talk about it like that, but that's kind of what it is. It's a representative body within our staffing structure that makes a recommendation. So I think about it more as the informal, but it's called the results team.
Do you find, and I don't know, maybe this was kind of where Mr. Stewart was going with the insurance question, but do you find that there's any city services that are so, that are less visible and maybe somewhat underappreciated? I just thought of our cemetery, and just because at least at this point it's not something that's necessarily out in the forefront of people's minds when they think of city services. But maybe there's something better. It's just because it's kind of less visible. I'm not thinking of them right now, but anything like that where, and I'm kind of looking at that fourth quartile. It gets to the end of the process and it's like, oh, this scored really low, but we're not going to cut this. I mean, obviously we have to provide this, and so it's funding anyway.
Yes, and we see those programs, and then we have seen programs that we have cut on the bottom too. Programs that we just, over time, we said, it doesn't make sense that we're doing this anymore. It's something that maybe a council member or someone in the community wanted 15 years ago, and we're just continuing to do it. I remember the chief of staff of Lincoln, Nebraska, they were doing this parade. They were in charge of actually running the parade. And I can't remember what the parade was, but it was something that took up a lot of time and a lot of resources and manpower. And they did, the other part that I haven't talked about is you could do a citizens survey as well to help feed some of this information. And they're really prolific at that. So they did an online survey where they did this kind of cost exercise and had all these different programs, and that one ended up on the bottom. And so they felt, hey, we can get rid of this. And it ended up, most of the community was fine with it, just going away. It was like this really there were some vocal citizens that did not want it to go away. And those sometimes are the people that end up, they're the ones that go to council meetings sometimes. But they're able to make that decision and show it with the data that they could actually cut that program at Guano. Another example that I'll throw out there that happened to us was we have this library program called reciprocal borrowing, where we provide library cards to those that live in the county, that they can come in from the county, because a lot of the schools are in the city. So they're coming in to those schools, especially at the high school, but they can still use the library if they need to. The county was funding part of that program, and it scored really low. It was like $10,000. It was a small program, and because the county dropped the funding, so when we're scoring it, it scored low already, but then they dropped the funding, and so the results team said, we just don't want to do this anymore. It doesn't make sense. The county dropped the funding. How many people is this really impacting? The data wasn't a lot of people, so we said, we're just going to get rid of it. They took it to city council, and council said, no, we want to keep it. In spite of what the county was doing, which, there's a lot of, we were dealing with the county on lots of different issues, and they said, no, we want to keep funding that. So the results team recommended one thing, and the county said, no, we're going to keep that. Even though it scored really low, they felt strongly about it. It was $10,000, so it wasn't that big of a deal, but that's what we ended up doing.
Let me give you an example of what happened in Provo. Freedom Festival used to be under the city. There was a 4-3 vote to privatize it. And I think it's been far better not being under the city. So that was a program, and it was very, very controversial to privatize it.
Yeah, that's very similar to what happened in Lincoln Bright. In fact, they might have privatized. I think actually they didn't privatize, like a nonprofit took it over and ended up still doing it, and it wasn't like that expensive to do it. So the Freedom Festival is working out well. Then.
It's a nonprofit that runs it.
Yeah,
that's much better, I think, than the city could have done.
Right, and that's some of those questions they got to ask is this something that we should be doing? Is this kind of our mandate as a city, or are there other people out there willing to do it, other organizations?
The city lost the mayor's ball, but that was okay.
There's a good example of that in our budget last year, where we went through and we had contracted parking. So the parking administration was outsourced, and when we were going through the PFO process and putting parking management, then the parking guys came back and said, well, I think we could actually do this in-house better. And so they put forward a bid that actually reduced the budget, and they brought parking in-house. And the cost difference was about the same, but then when you're rating the level of service and the performance measures, that went way up. So our level of service in the community went way up for the same value. And I think that that's something that came out of looking at these other programs.
Yeah, because these things are always fairly complex, whether or not to contract out or do it in-house. A lot of times you bring it in-house, it could be more expensive, but maybe the level of service is a lot better. On that particular issue, the parking attendants were working out on Main Street, and we really wanted the parking attendants to be like ambassadors of Park City. And so it wasn't just, hey, you're giving out tickets, but you're actually kind of helping tourists and guiding tourists. And so we felt like our level of service could be a lot better, and that has been. We've gotten a lot of positive feedback, surveying citizens and council for that.
Are there off-the-shelf software solutions? It sounds like you went from Excel to something else. Is that a custom thing that was designed just for you and wouldn't transfer, or is that something you helped develop that is now could be picked up by it?
Yeah, it's there are software solutions out there to do this, and we did an RFP, and we had an idea of who we wanted to go with. Then once we did the RFP, this company out of DC called NewBrain, who works with a company called Board, and the application is called Board, submitted a bid that just kind of blew our mind and said, this is where we want to go. The big drawback for them was they hadn't worked with local governments. So they were doing more on the business side, on kind of performance management and looking at sales types of things. And so they have this system Yeah, if you're familiar with, you know, Windows software, it's got like Access, so it's a database, kind of, you can, it's a database manipulator. I don't know if that's the right word for it, but it's like Access on steroids. So it allows us to plug into our HR system as well as to our accounting system and take all that information, take that line item budget, distribute it to these BFO programs, and the managers can do it at very, I would say, user-friendly. So they can see all their positions, they can, you know, divvy it out by time, and they look at their materials and supplies, they divvy that out by the dollar amounts. And then they develop their programs right there in the software. And it's all tied to a performance management system. So as they're doing their budget, they're also plugging in their performance measures and how well these programs are, you know, how efficient they are, how effective, how well they're meeting the targets. You could definitely go that route with them. And like I said, I've been a reference for, I'd say, half a dozen cities, and most of them have gone with this company called New Brain. And what I've heard is that they really like it. It's really an amazing tool.
I've got a couple questions.
Yeah.
You mentioned you have, I think you said 6 or 7 in your projects in your department.
Yeah.
So how do you allocate expenses and time? Is that part of the software program? So, for instance, police. If I'm a detective, but I'm pulling somebody over for a traffic citation, how do you bifurcate?
Yeah.
What it gets billed to, and how do you do that?
Okay, so I think there's 2 parts to that question. One is how do we kind of take the line item budget and move it into these BFO programs, and then how are you actually expensing those things? Okay, so another, I would say, complexity and layers. I'm going to start with the last part of that. Is that our budgeting system isn't a complete match in terms of the expense side. So we're not actually, you can't see what the actual expenses are for each of the programs yet. There's some departments where we have been moving slowly to match the accounting system to the programs. And the tricky part about that is obviously, so if you're familiar with, you know, an accounting system, you have, you know, a line item where you have a general ledger, a string of numbers, and you have to be able to associate that with that program. Well, like we talked about before, our finance and our budget departments are separate. We didn't want to cause our finance department to have a heart attack, so we said, we're just going to do the budget side first, and then eventually maybe get more closely so we can actually see the expenses for those different programs.
All right.
And we have started to do that in some of our departments. So each one of the departments will take, so if you have one GL string and it's, let's say, divvied out 7 different ways, then we'll have a program number associated with that. We can do that within our accounting system. We just haven't done it citywide yet.
So another question is, I'm assuming like us, you have a lot of funding sources that are dedicated for specific needs, impact fees or rat taxes. How does that overlay all of this in the decision-making process?
Yeah, if you have different funding sources, you know, and this happens in the CIP as well, we have to keep them separate. So when we talk about this being a competitive process, we're not talking about citywide, we're talking within the funds themselves. So we have our general funds. They don't have a funding source unless we're looking at it in terms of like a fee. So if you have a building fee that's paying for a specific service, then we will dedicate that fee to that service. So now we're kind of building those connections. However, if it's like a grant or if you're in the enterprise fund, we actually have to separate out those programs. And it's really like we're looking at, we have a transit fund that's pretty, you know, robust, a water fund, we have a fleet fund, what else are missing? Golf has its own separate fund. There's some internal service funds. We have to keep those separate.
So would you have the 4 quadrants? Would you have 4 quadrants for?
Yeah, that was the general fund that I was showing.
Okay, all right. So I think one of the problems with the way most of this budget is, it just is what you mentioned, is you do it this way. You're poor, and so it gets a pass.
Yeah.
You tweak it a little bit. You have to fight that with this as well. So you're looking at all these programs, and, hey, this was a good one last year, and we already know what its score is, and you fight that as well as this.
Yeah, I would say it's better though because we actually are reevaluating every program every year. So we can actually look and see if those programs might need to go away or might need more funding.
But with it, some of them that have been reevaluated for
Yeah,
40 years,
there is that.
they're going to get a little bit of a pass.
Sure.
Some automatic assumptions.
Yeah. Well, and it's hard because the results team, you know, they only have a limited time. A lot of times what they focus on are the programs that are changing. They're either asking for funding or maybe we're trying to decrease the funding for them. And we tend to focus more on those rather than the ones that the funding's kind of staying the same. Maybe they score pretty high, so we're just going, we don't need to really change that. Yeah.
Can we go back to your slide presentation and the 6 stages again?
I think we can.
Yeah. That's now, as I look at this, it creates the impression that the council speaks at stage 1. The city manager is not involved until step 5, and I find that hard to believe. What's the relationship between the chief executive and the council at stage 1 and moving through the process? I mean, I understand that the council
integral to the
steps
process.
back
Yeah.
at stages at least 3, 4, and 5. Well, 2, 3, 4, and maybe gets more involved in 5. But the chief executive's got to play a big role at 1 as well.
Yeah, and I didn't go through specifically all the different roles and kind of outline those, but I have some slides for that. But the chief executive is definitely involved here. I mean, that's part of the council retreat, setting the priorities and the agendas, the outcomes that we're looking at for the year. Not as much involved in 2 and 3. This is really where I'm mostly involved. Number 4, not directly involved, but indirectly involved, I would say. I'm talking to the city manager all the time about all these different programs. A lot of times, managers are talking to the city manager anyway about all their and they need more funding. But the city manager in this case will always say, well, we have to take that to the results team. But usually they're very aware of everything. It's not like we have one meeting and say, okay, here's the budget. What do you think?
But it would seem to me that at some point you're going to reach a situation where you say, okay, we can give a 2% pay increase, but if we do, we're going to have to cut programs out of tier 4. And at what level does that discussion take place? Is that a 1 discussion, a 2 discussion, or a 5 and 6 discussion?
Yeah, that goes back to what Council Member Stewart was saying, is this is really just dealing with the DFO process itself, but then we have those other committees that are meeting, and we're setting the, each committee, we have to decide how much funding that committee could actually get. So how much can we use for the department requests? And that's in the results team. How much can we use for the CIP? How much can we use for a pay increase or health insurance? And that's all happening
in stage 4?
Well, I would say that that's happening outside of this process. That it's an input into this process all throughout it. Is that fair to say, Nate? Because you're intimately involved with this as well. So,
and you're constantly, as you get those costs that are in there, especially when you talk about pay, you're strategizing with the city manager on what direction you want to take. There's another graphic that isn't here where it shows all of these different things being in the total budget, and I think the city manager is involved with those different processes. A lot more with like when you look at purely a budgeting for outcomes process here or the CIP process, at least our city manager really wants to wait until 5 so that she's not interfering with the natural scoring. Because if she came in and said, I really think that this program is valuable, she's basically skewed the committee, and she recognizes that and doesn't want to do that. That said, at number 5, she's more than willing to adjust things around.
And is she actively involved at 1 as well?
Yes, she's basically leading one, I would say, leading the retreat and leading the goal discussion.
I would assume that in step one, you have situations where there may be new programs that are introduced that aren't currently being funded, and I guess they would go through the same process, and then the hope is if you didn't have new funding at the end of the day, you may select some programs that don't have as high a priority, so that new programs can be funded.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And we'll have that every year. We'll have new programs that we'll try and get funded, and they may score higher. And but that doesn't mean if they score higher, again, just because they score higher doesn't mean they automatically get funding. Because you wouldn't want to, axe out a program that, even though maybe the score is low, but there's still utility there. That's part of the art versus science. But, yeah, we'll have half a dozen a year, I'd say, new programs, and then we'll get rid of some programs too.
But assume also you may have a year where it kind of comes down to the employees versus the programs. For example, in order to give the employees a 2% raise, you may have to, in certain years, either not give the raise or eliminate programs in order to be able to do that.
Yeah, and I would say that that's kind of the entirety of the budget process. Because when I'm talking mostly about budgeting for outcomes, I mean, that's an inflationary thing, right? It's an inflationary, quote unquote. It's something that in order to maintain the same level of service, we're deciding as a city that we want to give a 2% raise or something like that. And that's, we're actually going through something similar with our council right now. But that's in addition to the budgeting for outcomes process that it's like running concurrently. We're trying to kind of figure out, we're just starting the process of figuring out what that pay is going to be. And then once we figure that out, we're going to get an estimate, and then we'll have to take that away from anything that the results team might be working on. Because that happens outside. Because the results team doesn't go in and they're going to decide each individual program whether or not they get a 2% raise. Because that wouldn't make sense, It happens outside of that.
But the results team is given a pot of money,
Yeah.
essentially.
Yeah, and like this council member said, it's kind of for each fund, really.
That's the mayor.
Looking at. Huh?
That's Mayor Curtis.
Oh, Mayor Curtis?
You pay me a great compliment.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And I realize we don't have our nameplates. We're in a very informal.
I know, I'm a little bit like, I wish I knew.
I can call those lawyers.
Nice to meet you.
Two thoughts on that. It seems to me that 2% pay increase could be considered just a increase in cost of the programs. Like now, this program costs 1% more because the human resources part of it, or the staff portion of that went up 2%.
Right.
And then in one, do you find in that council retreat, are new programs being proposed, or is it the outcomes are being tweaked, or is it both?
Well, it's mostly we're talking about the outcomes, but invariably council is talking about programs that they want to discuss at the same time. And it's more informal, I would say. It's more like, hey, I think we should think about doing this. I think our mayor right now is really thinking about poverty reduction. And that's not one of our behavioral programs right now. And so he might actually suggest that in our council meeting, in our retreat.
But couldn't that be an outcome and then let the departments or whoever say, well, hey, I can create a program that would address that goal?
Yeah, I mean, that's really what it is. It's, hey, here's some big ideas, but then how do you actually, what are the details and how would you make it work? What's the staffing involved? What's the materials and supplies budget for all that? What are some different options? So that's
the bidding process, right? I mean, that at least the way that I see this is the council is just making those outcomes, priorities. Hey, we want to reduce poverty, and then letting the city, administration, letting the different departments see if they can best. How do they think they can best?
That's exactly what happens. Is that in one, just like you said, they would say, "This is what my desire is. I want to see a poverty reduction." The city manager would then take that and say, okay, community development director, develop a program, put it into the budget process. Let's see how it scores, and let's work through those.
And the beauty of it, though, is it's not done in a vacuum. we can take it and evaluate it against all the other programs. We might come back and say, at this time, it didn't score really high, or we just didn't feel like we needed to do it. Now, that's obviously a great conversation to have, but it could happen, and we have had those situations before. I've had council members, direct me that they wanted something done, and then once we figured out all the funding for it, took it back and said, this is how much it's going to cost. These are the programs that we actually have to get rid of in order to do that. Do you want to do that? And in that case, they didn't end up wanting to do it. They said, it's not worth it to me at this point. Now that I see, this menu of items that I can choose from, it's not worth it. But it's still important. We can't fund it right now. Maybe it'll come back next year.
A couple years ago, partnership with, Bill Holterstrom is a leader in this community, president of United Way, Utah County. You sound like you know that.
No, I don't.
Oh, okay. I just thought that's all look. And he did some training about vision and setting outcome policies, which got me thinking. And said, where do you get this? And he referred me to work by John Carver called Boards That Make a Difference, and it talks about policy governance model. And that started a dialogue with several council members, which ultimately results in a dialogue with the council to look at taking more of a policy governance approach. And really the essence of the Carver work is the governing board, or in this case the council, is responsible for those outcome policy statements and to determine how much weight is given to each of those. And the administration or chief executive is responsible for that 2 to 5 to determine means and execute those means. And so really what I see, this policy governance approach that we've been talking about is a round peg and a round hole. And we're talking apples to apples here. But I think this is a next step possibly in developing that framework of thought.
Yeah, I mean, that's more of like the philosophy behind a lot of where this is coming from, is kind of the role of governance in cities. And what's the role of a city council versus the executive versus staff? And really, I think of it in a very straightforward kind of easy way is council is setting the agenda based off of citizen input, based off of town hall meetings, that type of thing, and setting the direction for the next year or two, also for 10, 15 years out, and then taking that to staff and saying, we want to see these things done, show us how it can get done, and if it can't, let's have a conversation about that. But there's a format for that, that there's a process that you go through, and you can actually look at all the programs that you provide in the city and point out that you're actually accomplishing a lot of what council wants. Maybe not everything, but mostly with the resources, limited resources that we have, we're getting the best bang for the buck. That's kind of how it works.
Question.
Sorry, I should
In the CAO first.
We have a number of outside entities with whom we contract for programs and services. For example, CDBG recipients, social service agencies, Downtown Provo Incorporated, Freedom Festival operations, and so on, where we actually have specific contractual relationships. Is there a process by which an outside entity comes in and says, I want to make a bid to do X and Y? Where does that fit in your process, or is it entirely outside?
In the literature, you could actually do something like that, and that could be part of that process. We haven't actually incorporated that, just because we haven't gotten there yet. But I think there's several things on our list of things to do, like changing our county structure, for example, of getting to that ultimate goal. But yeah, they could be part of that bidding process, and theoretically, you could have them bidding against things that city is providing right now. I mean, that is an option.
We kind of do have that a little bit that's starting to develop where we have, just last night we had a group come in from the community that wanted more arts and culture, and they were talking about, why do you have a recreation department if you don't have an arts and culture? what we've started to do, we've done it a couple of times, and I think it's going to be the course that we do, is we set up these blue ribbon commissions. And then the blue ribbon commissions actually in the span of all of these different things that are feeding in the budget, the blue ribbon commission becomes one of those things feeding in there. And so that would kind of be, okay, you go put together your proposals, we'll talk about it, and then the city manager will do the same thing that they would do with number one, with the council's inputs, but they would do it with this community input. They say, okay, this is what they want, put together a program that accomplishes this, let's put it through the process and see where it scores. And so that's kind of how, we haven't done it a lot, but that's the direction that I see us going. Yeah.
I think historically, we've kind of gotten into a little bit of a, as long as it's working, don't mess with it. And so Freedom Festival, for example, we have a 2-year contract with them. Every 2 years, we do a little reevaluation. But I would love the idea of saying, well, let's put them in the scoring matrix. Yeah. Let's figure out for those dollars we put in, the cash and kind, where we put back, and how's that changing over time. And again, that level of analysis of our outside contractual relationships just hasn't happened. So again, as we're thinking about this, we might want to think about that external component as well.
Yeah, that's a great, like, outside the box kind of next level. Is it's not just your dollars that you're spending on staff or the regular day-to-day operations, but all those contracts. There's lots of them. I'm assuming that for us, we have lots of contracts. We tend to get in that rut of just paying them every year, and we should be doing that, evaluating them versus everything else we got going on.
Any other questions, Mr. Briggs? Or Mr. Lockwood? Thank you very much for being here. Appreciate the information and the opportunity to sort of pick your brain on those things. Did you have one more question?
Not a question. I was just going to say that after reviewing some of those GFOA documents, it sounded good. I had some specific questions I came in to ask, and your presentation answered those questions. So I just really appreciate the great job that you guys did and for the help.
Let's give it a hand. It was a great presentation.
I could send this presentation to Matt, and if you guys want to look at it. And it's, we don't live too far away, so we're a resource for you if you want to go down this road.
Now it's doing basketball.
Yeah, I would love it. I watched the game on TV last night.
Another triple double.
Yeah, it was great. All right, thanks a lot.
Thank you. Well, we will take a 15-minute break and come back at 11 o'clock. Come back in 15 minutes. And
buying the same product. And then, a couple bottles, small bungalows or historic preservation underground. Temples a couple
The next item is, before we get to the next item, I'd actually like to have the opportunity to have some council discussion. We were able to ask questions of Mr. Briggs and Mr. Rockwood. And I think it would be good also to have a discussion amongst ourselves about what our thoughts are about this. And I include the administration in this as well. It's going to be obviously a very collaborative process. So I'd just like to get a little bit of feedback, sort of your impressions of what you thought, and what you think about the process so far.
If anyone else is going to jump in, I got plenty of thoughts. I love it. I think it is a best practice. I see a lot of benefits to it. But, and I think we can talk more about this later on. I think it would be important to talk more about it later on. It's a matter of priorities. I almost see it a little bit like the Good Landlord program, where we look at what are the outcomes and what are the benefits from putting in a budgeting for outcomes process. And it's, they've got those things listed. And I look at that and I would say that most of our citizens would say that we're already have that pretty well. And I think most of the staff and the council, we can look at our budgeting process, and I think there's room for improvement. But I think a lot of us would already say that we're already getting a lot of these benefits. And so we could go through what sounds like a pretty arduous process to get this implemented, but the incremental benefit may be small. And so when we're looking at other priorities, we need to me, as much as I love it, I think the amount of benefit we would get out of it for the amount of effort that would go in, I think there may be other priorities I'd rather spend. So just high level, that's my impression on it is, I like it, but I don't know if it priority is high enough for me.
To me, the greatest thing was having the opportunity to look at things that we're doing and say, are they creating the outcomes that we want? Are we actually, rather than just, this is what they did last year, this is what they did last year, if there's some way of prioritizing those projects that we are doing and actually going through, I think we did that with fees. To some degree, we're doing that with fees. Say, okay, this is what it's costing, this is the return that we're getting from this program or this fee. And it's just a challenge to be able to take the time to review all that and get the depth that we need, that we'd like to have. But it's the opportunity to say, is this giving our community what we want? And we do that to quite a bit, but I don't know how often we just fall back to this was last year's budget.
So we were kind of doing that yesterday with zoning enforcement. How much is it costing? What are we investing in it? What are we getting back? And is it meeting our goals? But we had to ask those questions because it's not readily apparent. We don't know exactly how much dollar-wise we're spending on it. It's not broken out necessarily that way. And it's not being analyzed on a regular basis that way. So we had to sit down and try to analyze it ourselves.
And I hope the department heads are doing that analysis. These are the benefits. This one doesn't feel comfortable. And I don't know if they have an a matrix for that, or if it's more of a gut feel, that they, when they analyze those each year, that's something that we should have in the city.
Sorry, then I would second that and look to the administration and staff. Sorry if I used the terms wrong, appropriately or whatever, but it sounded like Park City had a very specific performance measurement program system they were using. Does Provo City have a formal performance measurement system already in place that we're using to monitor and evaluate the performance of our systems, of our programs, services?
I can respond. I would say I really feel like we have a lean organization, but no, we are not evaluating at the level that Park City just shared with us all the programs in the city on an annual basis. I don't know if you agree with that, Mayor.
Well, yeah, I would. We're really pretty excited about an individual review process that we've started in the last years that I think is the basis. You have to almost do that before you do the programs. But I don't think that from a programs perspective, we're going to have to care. I think one of the things that I think I caught was in some regards they do themselves and some they don't either. So the health insurance, right, they're obviously not sitting down on the first of the year and saying, does that stay in our budget or does it not stay in our budget? But we've spent massive amount of time in evaluating our health insurance and is it the best one? Can it be improved over the years?
So outside of the budget, if I understood them correctly, that even before they started the budgeting for outcomes, they had a system in place where the services had to define outcome. I think the services had to define goals, and then they had a formal process of benchmarking. How well are we achieving the goals, the outcomes that we set for the service? So, and in the I remember that our acronym GFOA. I mean, it very clearly says that budget for outcomes is a component, works together, and cannot be, by itself without a performance management system. And so, okay, so I guess.
Yeah, the other thing I would add, in the last couple of years, we have made a change with the budget document, and we hadn't done it before, but we've actually been certified through, our budget's been certified through GFOA, and one of the elements that's required to be certified is to go out and identify throughout the city by department what those outcomes are that are expected and how we've done based on those outcomes.
Okay.
I think we've made some progress with our budget document, and we're headed in the right direction. But not to the level that Park City is.
Okay.
I'm really excited about this. I agree. It feels like a best practice, a direction we should head long term. But I also think that this is one of those areas in the box that we talked about at our last retreat of Sundance that's interdependent. It's something that we have to be in lockstep with the administration. And so in terms of timing and pacing, I think I would lean to the administration. Obviously, the mayor and John and Wayne and all the key people would have to be totally on board with this to do that. And, so that's kind of.
It resonates with me when we call it priority budgeting. Budgeting for outcomes, I never quite got it to the degree that when we're budgeting to our priorities. And so I'm very much in favor of it. And again, I agree with David that it's going to heavily depend on the administration. We can't do it.
Right.
We can say we'd like to see it done, but it's going to take.
Yeah, the other thing I would mention is probably concerns me the very most is that Park City has 4 full-time resources committed to budget, and their budget, their organization is typically smaller than Provo. We have 1, equivalent of 1. And so that's very concerning, and I don't, we just have a limited resource, and so if there really was a desire to do something similar to what Park City is doing, we would have to significantly increase the budget staff.
One other thing, just kind of echoing what Mr. Harding said, I do see this as a huge investment that would eventually yield a much bigger return, but I just not sure if this is the right time to make that investment. The administration have to give us some guidance on
A couple of thoughts. It really was helpful. I don't think I maybe we're close to understanding it before the presentation, but it was clear to me, and I think they were very clear with this themselves. Don't take this lightly. This is a big deal. And I think because of that, the enthusiasm or the momentum to do this actually isn't even really me or the administration. I think it's those who will be there for a career. If that makes sense. It's elected officials will come and go. If they're not excited about it, this is a problem. This will start hitting its stride towards the end of my next term, right? Before this is really in a groove going. And so, but another couple of observations that I think are important that may be important regarding. You wouldn't expect me to say in 2 years, would you? Now you can make all this my thoughts. Really important thoughts. So let's suppose that we came together and we said, yeah, the way we budget, we don't like it. There's some problems to it. We want to change the way we budget. I would suggest that if we were going there, that there's still other ways to budget that we would want to give equal amount of study before we determined that this was the one, zero-based budget. I mean, there's a number of types of budgeting that I think we would only want to change after pretty exhaustive research into those different things. The other thing I thought that was very interesting to me, and I think an important point, is that those 4 goals transcend current elected officials. And current elected officials can influence them and work with them. But I think it would be a mistake to try to take an organization as complex as the city and every year redo those goals. And now the city's shifting to an emphasis that's an emphasis this year and not next year. And that would be very painful for an organization if those goals didn't last a long time. And certainly slight modifications every year too. But you would need goals, once again, that would transcend probably this group here. It would be very, very long-lasting goals.
I really like that. I didn't understand it until he explained that those were the goals that you would look for, would be overarching and not changing from year to year. And I actually like that as well.
Good. So that,
I can wait.
okay. So I don't think we have a master list like they do, 140 or any number of services, but it would be nice to know what services we're providing, and maybe we could see a list and then look at it and say, I really, really want to know how much this service costs and how effective it is, and maybe focus on a few things and not all of them at once. My answer won't surprise you. If it's in your priorities, then we would be happy to do that. But be careful, because that one thing that you suggested could take a massive amount of time. Right, and I would only do that if it was very important. But it would be nice to have the menu and say these are the things that we're dividing and doing. Here's another possibility I thought about to just experiment with this a little bit. Is there are a couple of things that you can do this on a small scale. CDBG funding. And it would be really interesting to take all of these principles and apply them in a situation that is not so complex and it's not so cumbersome. And be able to microcosm of everything that you saw here, and could be done on a spreadsheet.
That's what excited me the most is really is budgeting by program. So you could take a department and separate its programs out and try it in a department, couldn't you, John?
Yes, and that's one of the other things. Right now, we are, as you're aware, we're in the process of going with this new Provo 360 citywide software system. And one of the things that we're going to be doing is setting up the chart of accounts in the new system. And this would be the key time to go in, try to set that up by project for each of the departments. And so that would be a big step. And I'm with the mayor. I think there are little things that we can do and learn at a minimum from what we've heard from Park City that we can incorporate, and then over time we can see if we want to evolve completely. But there are components that we definitely could do, and I think timing is really important.
What other questions? I'm sorry.
I was just going to very quickly put in an extra, Mr. Armand brought up that now is a good time to, we're putting in the ERP system to be able to code the data initially so that, I think I probably explained it better, but so that the communication can happen the way we want to have it happen and produce the reports you want to produce, that the software actually does what you want it to do given this new framework of how we're receiving information. Because it's different than what we've done in the past, correct?
Yeah,
and so
one point.
it's, so I agree with that, and I think if we are going to be asking for a different way of receiving information, build it into the system.
Yeah, the only challenge or concern is whether, we're getting ready to start that implementation shortly, and it's an 18-month implementation, and the question is, do we have the time and the resources to make those changes? But I think we should definitely look at it.
I guess the question would be: Is budgeting for outcomes in your mind? Are there other options other than budgeting for outcomes you think are superior that might be a better way of looking at this than you've been shown? That where we could do a study and look into lots of different ways of doing similar things, of expressing our desired outcomes and then having the budget be tied to those.
Well, I think, as the mayor said, I think it probably is worth looking at other options and delving deeper. As far as right now, with my understanding, I would think that we would probably want to delve deeper before I could respond to that question. But I was impressed with what we heard from Park City. I will tell you that in a lot of areas, we were talking about this sidebar conversation after the presentation, but in a lot of places we are already set up by program. The police department, primarily we are. In energy, we definitely are. And so it's just a matter of going through and analyzing all the departments in the city and trying to break them out by program. And so we're there in a lot of areas. So it's not, we don't have as much in some areas as we do others, but yeah, I think we have some opportunities.
Timothy, to some degree, we've done that with the software program because I don't know if you noticed this, but they don't track expenses. They only track budgeting. I would rather track expenses than budget. So that's one of the reasons we're really excited about the software program is this concept right now. For instance, he's unable to divide his time between the 7 projects he has in his department and allocate those expenses to those 7 projects. That's something I wanted to do, but had to be patient. We just don't have the software to do it. And so that's kind of what I mean by, like, is this where we want to spend our budgeting time and effort, or do we have a pretty darn good system that would like to refine it and make it a little bit better? Or is there still a third thing out there? And I think I'd just caution us before we go after this analysis to say just the analysis alone is going to occupy massive amounts of time. And do we have a broken system? Or do we have a system we can make a little better by some refinements?
Just a point of clarification, they don't track expenses, or they just track it differently?
So in a different system.
in a different system.
Right, so do you remember my question to him about how you allocate the time? So what he said was, well, accounting does that. We just budget. So budgeting for outcomes is all about budgeting, but not then sitting down at the end of the year and saying, well, you know, it's costing you more than it cost Provo to plant a tree. Or to build a pothole.
You know, if we're going to do a study, we have a council budget committee that has 2 world-class experts on it. And so, to me, if we're going to get advice and consent as a council, we want to set up a committee with people that recognize that consult worldwide on budgeting. And so I would suggest that we use that committee if you're going to do a study, and maybe add to that committee people from the administration or others that would. Well, actually, John's already a member of the committee, unofficially at least. So, however, I just would hate to get bogged down in a 2-year study before we start to do anything. Studies can really put us.
Don't get me wrong, I don't want to study. I like our budgeting method now. I'm just saying, but if you're going to switch to this one, before you do that, you would want to look at all the budgets.
I'm with you.
I would suggest that the council not lose sight of the bigger question, which in my mind is identifying, in step one, what are the desired outcomes that the council can articulate in terms of the goals you want to accomplish, and then what kinds of indicators do you need to have to know that those goals are being accomplished. How you get from 1 to 6, yeah, there are multiple ways to do it. I think there's a reason that VFO is considered a best practice by GFOA and ICMA, but it's certainly not the only way to get there. And our current way may get you there, but we still don't have the goals and the outcomes and the indicators. And I think that's, my suggestion would be that the council focus on that as the what you need to articulate. And then the second step is, okay, what's the best way for us to get that reported?
I just wanted to second that. I think I heard this came in on meetings last year. The administration asked, what are your goals? What are your objectives? What are we trying to accomplish? You can articulate that. Then our departments can develop the budgets around that and things like that. But that has to be articulated. So one, and then two is those indicators, and that's and in listening to all of this and trying to, I'm an expert on this, but in trying to apply those to what I've seen in Provo now, it seems to me that the biggest part that we might want to look at, or the most immediate thing we might want to look at those indicators, performance management. That may be where we want to look first. And it sounds like we're moving in that direction. And again, I'm not familiar with these things, but I'm just saying it seems like maybe the thing that would enable us to move forward best on this would just be looking at how do we track performance now? Do we want to make improvements to that? I think those two things, I understood what you said. I'm seconding that, but we need to look at what are our desired outcomes, how do we measure those? And I think the rest of the follow my
Council's made a couple of attempts to do that with department audits, but I don't really think those did what you were hoping for. But I think that's what the intent of the audits that were done. Was that type of thing.
Yeah, I'm talking about I'm talking about, if we're looking at parking or something, or speeding tickets. Should we have? How does Park City do it? How do other people do it? That do they have, like, we want X amount of tickets being written or X amount of revenue coming in, or do they look at it as, we want less than this many traffic accidents due to speed? And how do you measure how well your speed enforcement is taking place? So not department performance reviews, but service performance reviews.
So one of our great aspirations with this new software is the dashboard. That would be really, really close to what you're talking about on a daily basis, if that makes sense. And Wayne will tell you how much time we've spent and how frustrated we are with the current software and our inability to find that data entirely quickly. But I think if you spent some, and unfortunately, we're 18 months at the soonest away from having the dashboard, but if you spend some time on things that you would like to see on a frequent basis that would help you measure your goals, that's something that John's saying he tells them now. Over this 18-month period, to make sure that it does that.
One of the things that I wondered about, we have goals. For example, in the zoning thing, we want an effective zoning enforcement program, but we also want many council members with limited government. And so when we start talking about different goals and different outcomes, we need our priorities are a challenge to me. Is when I start thinking, what's more important to me, limited government, or is it a really, truly, a very, very, very effective zoning program?
My response to that is that it tempers your outlook on it. I mean, if at one time we used to have 12 or 8 or 6, what's the right number?
Right.
I mean, with limited government, 0. But we don't want 0. We do want some enforcement. So maybe, that becomes just part of the discussion.
And that's exactly that's where it is, and that's where the challenge is for 7 people to come up with a priority to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, because mine's 1 and 6, when his is 2 and 4.
Right, and that's why what you had us do was so helpful to review our feelings.
Council priorities might not be similar individual priorities. That's what you have. They have to be the majority's priorities.
And that's why I think there's a benefit in putting all of our priorities out there and see what priorities might we be more similar than different ones.
But to me, that's where we run into problems as we start to go down. We give our department heads, well, this is where we're at. This is how I can make this fit in with Vision 2030 in this area, but it doesn't quite fit into the other areas. And that's the hard part, I think.
Well, I think the benefit of this is if you have a priority, say someone comes to you and they say, hey, would you sponsor this to be, talked about a work session, or is there a way that you can help out with this, whatever item it is? And the thing that I like about this BSO process is you can have them weigh it. You can have them weigh it against all the other priorities, and then you can have data to go back to that person and say, you know what, it actually stacks up really well against the things that we're doing, or you know what, it doesn't stack up at all. And I don't think that now is the time to do that. And for me, that would be really helpful.
It'd be really interesting to see if the mayor gets his income program. At least the mayor wanted to cover it. But then I think you're right. He would have to put it through that process, and that's a good example of the mayor can't come and change those 4 things. He has to make it fit within those 4 things and justify everything and make it score more than those resources.
I think it was a very positive way of weighing our individual priorities against the priorities of the whole, and a good way for feedback and communication with citizens. And this is how it stacks up when we have a discussion, rather than just saying, personally, if people liked it or they didn't, or thought it was a good idea or didn't. I think it's good to say this is how it stacks up.
And I think talking about that reminded me of going through some of the literature that our budget review committee gave to us when we were evaluating some of the proposals, just about just that give and take and weighing things out, because if you spend money here, you can't spend money there, and allowing that the opportunity cost, and then looking at it that way, because it is a limited resource, and that approach, I think, is in alignment with what we're talking about there.
And it's something I've grappled with a couple of the customer organizations wanting the city to get involved, and would you sponsor it as a discussion, and that would be really helpful.
So I would love to see their manual, their 140, whatever it is. There's probably things they do that we don't do, and things that they don't do. But in general, there's a lot of similarity, I'm sure, and I'd love to see how they broke down what what was their thought process that, well, I can't say what the thought process was, but nonetheless, their finished product was 140 things they thought were worth tracking. And I'm not saying that I want to go anywhere with that other than that maybe the geek in me wants to see it and say, what did they think? And you know, that's why I asked about going up to their meetings. What would be the best time for us to come and observe? And so we talked about that.
I'm sorry, my reason, and I don't mean to cut you off. That means that
That's okay. I'm done.
it's a placeholder. But I've got a thought. Thank you. The way I see it is not necessarily like, hey, they identified 140 things that they want to track. It's they took everything that the city does and fit it into these 140 services or programs. So every single dollar that the city spends, well, I said that some of the contracts and things were outside of that, but pretty much the budget gets divided into these 140 programs. And if someone wants to do something different, then it's a new program and maybe you push something else out. But it's not just indicators of the tracking, but everything is organized that way for budgeting processes.
Well, yeah, that's what I want to understand, because at one point he says, well, you can deal with 200 or 300, right, but it becomes overwhelming. It's like, how fine do you want to divide it down and dissect it? You know, you have one department and one budget, or you have 10 things that department does, but maybe the department actually does 20 things, but you are only really worried about tracking 10.
Well, they do the 20, but you organize it into the 10.
Yeah, so it's like, how finely do you want to divide it?
Do you want to do parking services, or do you want to do on-street parking services and another service that deals with the parking garage stalls that Provo City owns, as well as, you know, the ones that have a parking program, as well as, you know, how fine do you want to break it, or do you just call that all parking service? Right. Right.
Thank you. Larry and Dave took most of my thoughts. That's okay. I'd rather have them share them. They're much more eloquent than I am. But this middle part, 2 through 5, is probably the mayor's purview. It's the mayor's purview. He's the chief executive. And I also agree with the idea that you need to be lockstep to see this happen. But my interest as your executive director is in 1 and 6. And that's because somebody 20 years ago, when they wrote this job description for me, said that one of my duties may include evaluate, report, make recommendations to the council as to whether the general intent of council policies in the form of ordinance or resolutions are being complied with and carried forth by the city, and determine whether additional ordinance, resolutions, or policies are required. Very difficult for me to evaluate when I'm not clear what the policy is. And I think mayors echo similar sentiment when he's requested the council state goals or priorities. Difficult, maybe it's a moving target to prepare the budget and know exactly what the council is. They have to be clear about their policies. And so, you know, I brought up the policy governance model. All of that's been for the intent to bring clarity to staff, at least my staff. I can't speak for the mayor, but and how we can perform that job function. And so, whether or not 2 or 5 are accomplished in this manner or with the status quo, if the council is involved in 1 and 6, I think we find ourselves in a position to help with that. And the second thought I had was I don't want to overcommit to anything because, again, prioritization of resources seems to be a theme for this retreat. But somebody mentioned a microcosm, a test case, and I'm interested in applying to the council budget, council office budget. And now, I'm not committing or anything. You can always order me to, but it's something I would just float as thought and willing to go on that venture to see how it could utilize a microcosm, even independent of the church.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. I have one. It would be more beneficial for the administration, for obviously for us to outline our goals. That's why we're here. To outline our goals, what we would like to see as outcomes, and not, and then from there on out, it's your decision. Oh, and then actually talk about the indicators, the things that we'd like to see happen, and how we would like the budget to be tied to these goals and outcomes. And leave it up to you, whatever process you use to achieve the indicators and the things. And we can outline those for you. We can provide our goals, the indicators we'd like to see, the reports that we would, or however we want the information so that we can understand it and see that our goals are clearly somehow tied to what's the process. And would it be your preference just to say, let us decide. If it's budgeting for outcomes, let us decide that. Let us decide the process of how we get there.
So I think I've died and gone to heaven. That doesn't mean that we don't want your suggestions, that we don't want you pointing things out to us, that we don't want your criticism. But I think some of the best things that have happened in the last several years have happened through that process. And a couple of examples that we brought up was transportation funding, where a need was identified, and the council was very, very clear that they didn't want to talk. That we were then tasked with giving you a method to do that. And we went out and we actually came with one that I liked a lot. And the council said, close, but not, we don't like it. And we didn't have TUF in our original proposal. So we went back and we worked on it. We came back with the TUF, joined with the council, taking it to the residents in one united voice. And something really significant, you talk about this, our lines, one of the major moves in those lines happened through that process. I believe we have a team that's unmatched, bias, and I like our team, but I really think, the same team that did the Google Fiber, and the same team that did the TUF, and the same team that built the recreation center is behind you. And you have access to that great team. And I try not to tell them how to do it. I can make the same mistake myself. I said, John, here's how I want you to budget. So we would love that. And don't interpret that as you can't comment, you can't make suggestions, and all of those things. And we welcome we welcome that. But at the end of the day, we like to have a lunch in order and then go make it happen.
And my thought with that is if we can clearly outline our goals, if we can, if it's important for us to be able to have a rating system where we can bring some, proposals or know how they rate. If we have an idea, say how does this stack up against other things? If there are certain things that we would like to be able to do and have feedback from the budget, we could put in those, like that's what I'm talking about, indicators, different things that we would like to be able to have access to within the budget process. But then whatever mechanism,
right. And one thing I would slightly say to alter that, and Dave Souls wrote an example where he's come to us, he's got some goals that he wants to do with economic development and things like that. And instead of just coming to us and saying, look, here's our end outcome, go make it happen, he's been very, very good to come to us and say, well, if I ask this of you, what would that do to you? And that's allowed us to then influence his ask of us in a way that we know how to do it, that it doesn't take us off course on the other things that we're doing. And that's important feedback, because you may ask something of us that takes us off course. It's something that is mission critical, and if we're just bound to go make it happen, that could be problematic. So
that would be a majority of the council that would ever,
yeah, but hopefully you do ask, understanding what you're asking of us.
So in my mind, if we had sort of listed out these are the things that we'd like to see within the budget process, to be able, the information we'd like to be able to glean from it, and that we can provide you with our overarching goals or in our, goals for the year. Be able to itemize maybe out some of that, what we'd like to see that we're not getting currently that we would like to receive, and then you find the mechanism for providing that.
Now, a really good example we're going to talk about this afternoon is the building maintenance funds, where the council spoke very loudly last year on the building maintenance funds. We're now prepared to come back to you and say, we don't know how to get there. We're going to need your help to get there, council. And so, I guess I bring that up to say, even if you come together and say, hey, we want this to happen, we may be back to you saying, okay, that we need additional revenue, or we need something from you in order if we're going to do that.
And I think that would be much easier for us to evaluate if we were able to, evaluate it against other programs that we currently think of as priorities. So that's why I personally love the whole idea. I like budgeting for outcomes. If there's something else that could get us there too, I think I'd be good with that too. I like what I've seen, and I like the information, and the way that the information would be received, and the way that we could actually weigh things against each other. And I think that would be helpful for us to make a decision rather than thinking, well, it's important, but how does it stack up against everything else? We really don't know. We don't have the information, so I appreciate that.
Something the mayor said just really resonated with me, and apologize for sharing it, but maybe it'll make sense to you as well. But so I'm an engineer and do a lot of different things, but one of the things occasionally we need a widget. So I'll go on the computer and I'll design this widget, create the drawing to communicate it, and then I'll walk it over to machinists in the machine shop and hand it off to them, and I make it. And if I follow that, in a week and a half or something, I get the part back, and they spend a certain amount of time on it, and certain cost or whatever. And that's an ineffective way of doing it. What's effective is I design it, kind of put in the things that it needs to function, and then I go over to the machinist and I say, here's what I'm thinking about. Tell me how to improve this so you can make it easier, and what are the challenges you're going to face, and then he'll give me that feedback. I'll go back and I'll make those changes, and now instead of taking a week and a half and $200 or whatever it costs the company to make that, $30, and I get back the next day because this feature on it made it impossible to work on a lathe or something like that. But so that idea of here's a goal of mine, here's the outcomes that I think we want, and then going to the administration saying, this is kind of what I'm getting at. How can we best achieve this? How can we redefine these outcomes, or how can we, how is this going to work best? I think is a good way to work together. If that makes sense.
So we talk about what the council wants, and we come back and council getting what they want. And yeah, that's important, but I think we also need to, and I think we have been focusing on what does the customer want? What's the customer satisfaction, whether it's they like the rec center, are they happy with our police department? And so knowing how the different services that are important to the public are being perceived, and whether we feel well served, indicators.
We've been doing an annual survey of our residents and asking about each department. So this will be our third or fourth year, so I've got some good current data to see if we're going up or down. And we'll be doing that before too long. It'd be good, Johnson, to get a hold of the previous survey and see if different questions you would like us to ask than we're asking.
So we need to move on to the next item, but I want to, it seems that most are favorable towards this type of process. There was some reservation about the cost or the timing of the implementation. But would it be good to have Brian or Matt to have a motion in the effect that we would like to that we would like the administration to evaluate, or what's the word? Is it better just for us to outline our goals and what indicators we would like to see, and then bring that at the end of the retreat if we can get to that point? Or would it be good to recommend that they look into these programs and then they decide what would be able to deliver the similar outcomes, right? We like this process, we like the outcomes of the this process. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think
Is that better to come at the end of the retreat when the goals are established, or to maybe?
I think it's your prerogative, but
Yeah, I would say, and this is, I'm venturing into the realm of giving policy advice instead of legal advice, so.
Well, I'm wondering more on, do we need a vote? Do we need like sort of a unanimous vote to be able to move something forward where the administration has some confidence moving forward that we're all on board with whatever we said motion is?
I think that is constructive and helpful when you express it by vote, because then there's clarity that the motion is the will of the majority.
And I think, yes, that's clearly true. If there is something that is the will of the majority you want to express to the mayor, then having a motion to do so is the right way. And going back to what you said a second ago, clearly the expressing the goals and the outcomes shown up there is in part one, is the prerogative of the council. To the degree that you're saying, is there a basis for? Is there a basis for indicating that you aren't satisfied with the way that the administration is currently giving you a way to measure those? Right? I mean, I guess the point I'm trying to make is maybe you're jumping ahead by saying we're gonna establish our goals and priorities, and we're also going to give you an expression that we want you to evaluate a whole bunch of different ways in which you could best tell us whether we're meeting those goals and priorities. And you can do that, but the other way to do it is just to express the goals and priorities, like you said, and then see how they demonstrate them to you. And if they demonstrate them to you in a way that you're not satisfied with, then express your dissatisfaction upon it.
Okay. I don't know that I'm describing myself as a
I prefer to wait to the end of our discussion and see where it fits on the priority list. We may have so many priorities that will feel that the administration, I think we should just know that sounds like it's at least some aspects here are priorities, but wait until we kind of lay them all out before we decide what we're going to express.
But, and it'll be important when we go to our goals. I guess that I'm wanting to know if this is something that, and it sounds like just one by one, that this is a process that most feel would be beneficial. And so when we actually go to the goal portion, are we going to be looking at our overarching goals, the budgeting for process, or budgeting for outcomes, recommends, like looking at the long-term overarching goals for the city, or are we going to be looking at individual priorities and just hammering out individual priorities? What is our focus for that piece of it? Because if we're kind of going with this process, then we want to have our overarching goals and then for all of our other priorities. Because I think last year was more individual, very specific goals in our budget intent statements and in our just general council goals. They were very specific. They were not overarching. They weren't long-term. They weren't looking, for goals that are unchanging necessarily. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to get a feel for the council is this a process that brings some information that we feel is helpful? Is that the direction that we hope to be going? And then whatever mechanism the administration finds for delivering this information to us, we're okay with that. I guess is where
and a couple of things to say, just cautiously keep in mind is this. I think this place we all want to be with interdependency. That makes sense, and that's why I'm careful not to say don't get involved in the process at all, because if it's interdependent, then there is some of that. But I think it's a very fine line between asking the administration to report to you, which we don't, and asking for information from us. So I think that's important to have out there as we hone in on this, talk about where you want to be. And the other thing is, I think I've talked about this before, but let me tell you that sometimes I feel left out of the conversation talking about setting city policy, because there's clearly some policy that is totally council policy, and your goals and your aspirations and all those things that I don't think I should have much of influence. But as we shift into that vision level and overall reaching for the, I do think I see the table that as well, involved in that conversation.
And that's absolutely, I think we talked about that in the beginning of the meeting, that would be the goal. And I'm more focused on council and establishing our goals right now so that we can actually give you some sort of idea of what we collectively think, and then we can marry the two.
Those match with this higher level, whether it's Vision 2030 or does that make sense?
Right, and I would expect that administration would be very involved with the overarching goals as well. But I'm thinking as far as when you did your retreat, if you're one person, you have your administration, but you're one person, you're able to say, hey, these are my goals and priorities, right? So, but as a body of 7, we come with our individual priorities, and then we decide collectively what things kind of make it, right? And what things are amongst the group of us. How many of us feel the same way, where we can say, yes, this is collectively important to council, and we have to do that first. And so it might feel like you're being left, you might feel left out during that process, but that's the nature of what we do and have to get to that.
Totally agree with that.
So, okay, and then we work with your goals as well to see city goals and plans. So it does probably feel very much like you'll be left out during the council discussion of just council goals. Okay. And then as far as bringing us information, I was mostly talking about when you present the budget, when you and those types of things, and then the idea too of being able to bring information in and say, hey, how does this stack up against programs? That might not be just a budget thing, it might be throughout the year. If you have that information available, that would be really beneficial. And so those kinds of things, letting you know the things that would be important to us as a council to be able to do what we do as well. So that's kind of, that makes sense.
I'm not advocating for this, but I would propose that we consider the 8 statement of core values that were developed in the Vision 2030 process. Looking through this, many of them were similar to the ones that were listed up there for the 5 or 6 cities that were already doing the budgeting for outcomes. Some of them align pretty well, some of them are unique, I think, but I think that could, if we could discuss whether we want to adopt these 8 as our overarching goals, our values that we pursue, and then we can look at priorities, what we want to get done that will support these 8 values.
And I think that when I looked at my goals and priorities, I tied them back to 2030 as well, because that's where the citizen groups came up with, and I think there are ways that some of the goals, I don't have all 8, but some of the goals that I worked on are tied in to definitely those categories.
So along that same line, do we just go with the 8, or do we go through the process that they went through, but kind of consolidate it?
Good question.
I love talking about Vision 2030, and I'm sure that won't surprise anyone. We're somewhat in the process of reviewing that right now, and I would say if 8 are close, that you accept them knowing that part of the relook at Vision 2030 will do that. Decide if they're the right ones, if they need more consolidated. That's a process that we're kind of hopefully making some progress on right now.
Thank you. I think lunch is here, so I think it's a good time to break for lunch. And do you have a team exercise? Okay. So I think we have something planned.
Just it's competitive.
Okay, so staff is preparing something fun and exciting for us to do while we have lunch.
It's like you need a break. This is all very heavy.
So it's just sort of a juice for 10 minutes and have a little lunch, and then we'll resume.
Is that first or
Let's see first. I think everybody's probably hungry.
so we can make a couple calls.
Yeah.